The wind that carried the spring petals also carried a silent, unseen weight. If you were to stand in the narrow, winding streets of a Japanese city in the 1920s, you would see a world caught in a delicate, breathless space between two eras. The wooden eaves of ancient houses still sloped gently toward the earth, their clay tiles warmed by the afternoon sun. The smell of sweet roasted potatoes and damp earth lingered in the alleyways. Yet, just above the rooftops, a new horizon was taking shape. Black iron telegraph wires cut across the pale sky like sudden, sharp thoughts. In the distance, the low, steady thrum of factory smokestacks hummed a ceaseless rhythm, a deep vibration that you could feel in the soles of your feet even before you heard it. This was the dawn of a modern empire, a time of grand ambitions and towering steel. But grand ambitions are rarely felt in the grand ways by the people who must carry them. Instead, they are felt in the quiet, hidden corners of everyday life. They are felt at the dinner table. They are felt in the tired sighs of a father returning home. They are felt in the anxious, careful way a mother counts her coins by the dim light of a solitary lamp. Imagine a man named Hiroshi. He is not a general, nor a politician, nor a wealthy merchant. He is simply a man who wakes before the sun, tying his worn shoes with quiet dignity. For generations, his family had worked the soil, their lives dictated by the gentle, predictable turning of the seasons. The rain told them when to plant, the frost told them when to rest. But the world has changed rapidly beneath Hiroshi's feet. He now works in a sprawling brick textile mill on the edge of the city. His days are no longer measured by the arc of the sun, but by the sharp, unforgiving shriek of the factory whistle. Every evening, when Hiroshi slides open the paper screen door of his home, he brings the smell of machine oil and coal dust with him, a scent that never quite washes out of his dark cotton jacket. He sits on the woven tatami mat, his shoulders heavy, his hands calloused not from earth and water, but from iron and grease. He does not complain. It is not his way. But in the quiet moments, before he speaks a word to his family, you can see the profound exhaustion settling into the lines around his eyes. It is the exhaustion of a man who feels he must run just to stand still. The empire demands progress. It demands endless production, endless modernization, a relentless march forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with the great powers of the world. And the weight of that march presses down directly onto Hiroshi's tired shoulders. His wife, Hannah, watches him with a silent, tender understanding. She pours him a cup of green tea, the steam rising between them like a fragile ghost. She knows the pressure he feels, because she feels it too, a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that never entirely fades. Hannah is the silent architecture of their lives. She is the one who stretches the evening meal, adding more broth to the soup when the price of rice climbs just a little higher at the market. And it always seems to be climbing now. The newspapers that wrap the vegetables she buys speak of a glorious, expanding nation, of distant markets and modern marvels. But the reality in her small kitchen is different. The cost of charcoal for the winter hearth is rising. The landlord has spoken, politely but firmly, of needing more rent. The world is accelerating, spinning faster and faster, and Hannah feels a quiet, unspoken terror that her family might simply be shaken off, left behind in the dust of all this glorious progress. She sits by the window in the late evening, a basket of mending in her lap. The needle dips in and out of the fabric, a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Beside her on the low table sits a crumpled letter from her brother in the countryside. The words on the thin paper are few, written in a hurried, nervous hand. The silk market has crashed. The harvest was poor. The village, once a place of deep, rooted stability, is slowly suffocating under debts it can never hope to repay. Her brother writes of young girls from the neighboring farms going away to the cities, to the mills, their childhoods traded for a few extra coins to send home. Hannah smooths the letter with her thumb, a gesture of distant comfort. She folds it away, out of sight, not wanting to burden Hiroshi with more worry. This is how the pressure of an empire manifests. It is not a sudden explosion. It is a slow, tightening constriction, a silent agreement to carry burdens alone, to smile when the heart is heavy, to pretend the foundations are not trembling. And then, there is their son, Kenji. He is 8 years old, with eyes wide and full of tomorrow. Every morning, he puts on a stiff, dark uniform with brass buttons, a miniature soldier of the new age, and walks to the local school. The schoolhouse used to echo with folk tales and the gentle reciting of poetry. Now, it rings with marching songs and stories of unwavering loyalty, of duty, of an island nation surrounded by a vast, envious world. When Kenji comes home, he sits by the low table, carefully copying characters into his notebook. He tells his parents about the maps on the classroom wall, vast expanses of the world colored in bold inks. He speaks with innocent pride of the great ships being built in the harbors, of the trains that cut through mountains. Hiroshi and Hana listen, nodding gently, their hearts swelling with love for their boy. But beneath the pride, there is a shiver of unease. They see how the world is shaping him, molding his soft clay into something harder, something rigidly focused. They hear the innocence in his voice when he sings the new anthems, unaware of the heavy, dark currents of history those songs are designed to navigate. They want to protect him, to keep him in a world of bamboo toys and summer festivals, but the doorway of their home cannot keep out the changing century. The empire needs Kenji's generation to be strong, to be unyielding, to be ready for whatever the future demands. And so, a quiet wedge is driven between the old ways of the parents and the new world of the child, a separation born not of anger, but of the relentless tide of time. One evening in late April, the family takes a rare walk to a nearby shrine. The air is surprisingly soft, carrying the faint, sweet scent of blooming cherry trees. For a few moments, the grinding noise of the city seems to fade away. The ancient stone lanterns line the path, their moss-covered surfaces soft in the fading light. Above them, the branches of the cherry trees are heavy with pale pink blossoms, glowing almost luminescent against the twilight sky. It is breathtakingly beautiful. It is a scene that has played out for centuries, a timeless reminder of the delicate, fleeting nature of life. They stand together under the canopy of flowers. Kenji reaches up, trying to catch a falling petal in his small palm. Hana leans her head against Hiroshi's arm, and for a long, quiet breath, the invisible weight lifts. They are just a family, standing in the gentle dusk, breathing in the spring. But even here, the world intrudes. A sudden, sharp gust of wind sweeps through the courtyard. It is not a warm breeze, but a cold draft that seems to carry the chill of distant mountains. The wind tears through the branches. The cherry blossoms, so perfect and full only moments ago, are stripped from the trees in a violent, swirling storm of pink snow. They fall around the family in a chaotic dance, covering the stone path, clinging to their clothes. It is a beautiful sight, but it is also profoundly melancholy. The blossoms are celebrated exactly because they do not last, because their beauty is tied to their inevitable, sudden end. Hiroshi watches the petals scatter across the ground. He pulls his thin jacket a little tighter around his chest. He feels that cold wind deep in his bones. It feels like a warning, a whisper from the encroaching dark. The world he knows, the quiet dignity of his small life, feels just as fragile as those falling petals. The newspapers promise strength. The factory whistle demands endurance. The schoolhouse teaches pride. But in the quiet hollows of his heart, Hiroshi wonders where this relentless wind is blowing them. The nation is building walls of steel, forging weapons of modern might, driven by a deep, unspoken fear of being weak, of being conquered, of being starved of resources in a world that seems increasingly hostile and unforgiving. The leaders say they must expand to survive, that they must reach out across the sea to secure their future. To Hiroshi, to Hana, to millions of families sitting quietly in their homes, these grand geopolitical designs are abstract, distant things. They do not want conquest. They do not want war. They only want to know that next winter, there will be enough coal for the fire. They only want to know that their son will grow up to be safe and happy. But as the twilight deepens and the last of the cherry blossoms drift into the shadows, the silence of the shrine feels different. It is no longer the peaceful silence of rest. It is the tense, holding breath silence of waiting. The pressure in the air is palpable, a heavy humidity before a storm breaks. They turn and walk back toward their home, the glow of the city's electric lights painting the clouds above in a hazy, artificial orange. The old world is slipping away beneath their feet, petal by petal, memory by memory. And the new world, vast, hungry, and demanding, is rising up to meet them. They walk close together, a small island of warmth in the cooling night, stepping quietly into the gathering shadows, entirely unaware of the long, dark road that has already been laid out before them. Even the oldest stones of the city seem to hold their breath in the twilight. If you were to walk through the ancient, labyrinthine alleyways of Beijing as the sun began to dip behind the western hills, you would find yourself wrapped in a world that felt entirely removed from the rush of the modern century. The locals called these narrow passages the hutongs. They were lined with high, gray brick walls that guarded the quiet courtyards within, their sloping tiled roofs curving gently toward the sky like the outstretched wings of resting swallows. The air here was a rich tapestry of scent and memory. It smelled of coal dust and roasting chestnuts, of sweet potatoes baking in iron drums on the street corners, and of the dry, ancient earth blown in from the distant Gobi Desert. As evening approached, the sounds of the day softened into a comforting rhythm. You could hear the steady, rhythmic pedaling of a bicycle, the soft, sweeping shuffle of cotton shoes on the paving stones, and the distant, melodic call of a street vendor selling sweet hawthorn berries. It was a city that had watched dynasties rise and fall, a place deeply anchored to the slow, heavy turning of history. But as the 1930s stretched on, a new sensation had begun to drift through the alleys. It was not a sudden noise or a visible threat. It was an invisible tremor, a cold, quiet draft blowing down from the north, carrying with it a profound and nameless unease. At the corner of one such alley stood a small, unassuming shop. Its wooden doors were worn smooth by decades of passing hands. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of warm animal glue, split bamboo, and old paper. This was the domain of Master Liang, a man whose hands were permanently stained with the ink and dye of his trade. He was a maker of paper lanterns. Master Liang was a man of few words, preferring to let the gentle scrape of his carving knife and the rustle of delicate paper speak for him. He sat on a low wooden stool, his back slightly bowed, patiently bending thin strips of green bamboo into perfect, elegant spheres. To watch him work was to watch a meditation. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, tying the bamboo frame with silken thread before brushing a light layer of paste over the wood. Carefully, he would lay the translucent paper over the skeleton, smoothing out the wrinkles with the side of his thumb. His shop was a sanctuary of soft light and quiet creation. But lately, Master Liang found himself pausing in his work. He would hold a half-finished lantern in his lap, his eyes drifting toward the open doorway, staring out at the fading light of the street. He could feel the shadow gathering in the north. Everyone could. It was an unspoken weight that pressed down on the shoulders of every shopkeeper, every rickshaw puller, every mother carrying her child through the market. The piece they clung to felt exactly like the paper in Liang's hands, beautiful, luminous, and terrifyingly fragile. A small brass bell chimed softly above the door, breaking the silence. An older man stepped over the raised wooden threshold, meticulously brushing the dust of the street from his long, dark silk robe. This was Professor Wei, a scholar of history from the nearby university, and one of Liang's oldest friends. Wei's face was lined with the heavy exhaustion of a man who read too much and slept too little. Round, wire-rimmed spectacles sat upon his nose, capturing the dim light of the shop. Liang offered a warm, silent nod and set his lantern aside. He moved to the back of the room, where a small charcoal brazier glowed with a comforting, steady heat. Without a word, he set an iron kettle over the coals. The ritual of brewing tea was an anchor for them both, a familiar, grounding rhythm in a world that felt like it was beginning to tilt on its axis. When the water began to sing, Liang poured it over curled jasmine leaves in a porcelain pot. The fragrant steam rose into the cool air, sweet and floral, chasing away the chill of the evening. He poured the pale golden liquid into 2 small cups, handing one to his friend. They sat together on wooden stools, the warmth of the tea seeping into their cold hands. For a long time, they simply watched the steam curl and vanish. When they finally spoke, their voices were hushed, barely rising above a whisper. They did not speak of grand political movements, or the movements of armies, or the fiery speeches of leaders in distant capitals. They spoke of the quiet, intimate fears that kept them awake in the dark. Professor Wei stared into his teacup, his voice trembling ever so slightly. He spoke of his students. He told Liang how the young men and women in his lecture halls no longer looked at the ancient texts with wonder. Instead, their eyes were filled with a restless, burning anxiety. He spoke of the train lines heading north that had suddenly stopped running, of the letters sent to cousins in Manchuria that were returned unopened, stamped with unfamiliar foreign seals. The border, Wei whispered, was creeping closer. It was no longer a distant line on a map, it was a shadow stretching across the plains, reaching toward the ancient walls of their city. He confessed his deepest, most private fear to the lantern maker. He did not fear for his own life, he said. He was an old man, and his days were already written. What he feared was the loss of the quiet world. He feared that the poetry, the ancient songs, the simple, beautiful rhythm of the changing seasons in the courtyards would be swept away by a storm of iron and fire. Master Liang listened, his face a portrait of quiet empathy. He did not offer empty reassurances. He knew the scholar's fears were real. Instead, he simply reached out and poured another cup of hot tea. It was a small, everyday gesture of kindness, but in that moment, it held the weight of profound resistance. It was a silent promise that, here in this room, the old ways, the gentle ways, still mattered. Just then, the shop bell chimed again. A young mother entered, holding the hand of a little girl whose cheeks were flushed pink from the evening chill. The girl's eyes went wide with wonder as she looked at the lanterns hanging from the ceiling, spheres of ruby red, pale yellow, and soft jade, painted with delicate brushstrokes of plum blossoms and leaping carp. The mother smiled apologetically, asking in a soft voice if they had a small, simple lantern for the autumn festival. Master Liang stood, his knees popping slightly, and retrieved a beautiful little lantern made of crimson paper, shaped like a lotus flower. He handed it to the little girl, whose face instantly broke into a radiant, unguarded smile. Wei and Liang watched as the mother and daughter stepped back out into the darkening street, the little red lantern swinging gently from the girl's hand, a tiny beacon of joy against the encroaching night. When the door closed, Liang turned back to his friend. He picked up his carving knife and a fresh strip of bamboo. He looked at the scholar with a soft, enduring strength in his eyes. "The glass from the west is hard," Liang said quietly, returning to his work. "It is rigid, and when it is struck, it shatters into 1,000 dangerous pieces. But our paper is different. It is thin. It is vulnerable. The wind can push it, the rain can soak it. But it bends. It breathes. And as long as there is a candle inside, it will hold the light." Professor Wei smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached the tired corners of his eyes. He finished his tea, thanked his friend, and stepped out into the evening. He walked slowly through the winding hutongs toward his home. The sky above the courtyard walls had turned a deep, bruised indigo. The stars were beginning to emerge, cold and distant. He reached his own heavy wooden door, pushing it open to reveal his private courtyard. In the center stood a very old pomegranate tree, its leaves turning the golden, brittle yellow of late autumn. The house was perfectly quiet. Wei went into his study and lit a solitary oil lamp on his desk. He pulled a thick block of black ink and a carved stone mortar from a drawer. Slowly, methodically, he dripped a small amount of water onto the stone and began to grind the ink stick in a continuous, meditative circle. The soothing, scraping sound filled the quiet room. He unrolled a scroll of raw, textured paper and picked up a bamboo brush. He was writing a letter to his younger brother, who lived far away in the misty, southern hills of Nanjing. He did not write about the rumors of troops massing on the borders. He did not write about the anxiety gripping the city, or the terrifying silence from the north. Instead, he wrote about the yellow leaves falling from the pomegranate tree. He wrote about the sweet taste of the roasted chestnuts he had bought from the vendor on the corner. He wrote down a few lines of an old poem about the enduring strength of the winter pine. It was an act of quiet, stubborn heroism. In the face of an overwhelming, encroaching darkness, the professor chose to document beauty. He chose to remind his brother, and himself, that the gentle, human moments were worth remembering, worth preserving, even as the storm gathered on the horizon. Outside, the city of Beijing was settling into the deep of the night. The grand gates of the ancient city walls were closed, a vast, heavy defense built for a different era, useless against the modern machinations of the world. Down in the alleyway, Master Liang closed the wooden shutters of his shop. Before he locked the door, he hung a single, beautifully crafted paper lantern on a hook beneath his eaves. He struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating his deeply lined face, and touched it to the candle inside. The lantern glowed with a warm, amber light. It swayed gently in the cold, northern breeze. It was entirely fragile, completely defenseless against the dark. And yet, it pushed the shadows back, casting a soft, golden circle of warmth onto the cold, gray stones of the street. Across the sprawling, ancient capital, millions of people were pulling heavy cotton quilts up to their chins, holding their loved ones close, and closing their eyes. They were a people caught in the breath before the breaking of the world, relying on the quiet strength of their traditions, the deep roots of their culture, and the fragile, enduring hope that the morning light would always, eventually, return. The cold did not simply touch the skin, it sank into the bone like a heavy, silent memory. If you were to stand out on the vast, sweeping plains of Manchuria in the dead of winter, you would be struck first by the sheer, unending emptiness of it all. It is a landscape of profound and humbling scale. For miles in every direction, the earth is swallowed by a sea of pure, unbroken white, stretching out until it finally blurs into a pale, bruised purple horizon. The wind here does not blow, it howls. It sweeps down from the Siberian tundra, carrying a bitter, biting frost that coats everything it touches in a delicate armor of ice. Cutting through the center of this endless white silence were two thin lines of dark, heavy iron. These tracks were a lifeline, an artery of steel binding distant, warm islands to the frozen heart of the continent. And standing beside these tracks, reduced to a mere speck in the vastness of the snow, was a young man named Noboru. Noboru was a railway guard, though the heavy rifle slung across his shoulder felt less like a weapon and more like an anchor dragging him down into the drifts. He was barely out of his boyhood, his cheeks still carrying the soft roundness of youth, though they were now perpetually raw and wind-burned. He wore a thick, wool-lined coat and a heavy cap pulled low over his ears, but the Manchurian cold was a living, searching thing. It found the tiny gaps in his collar, the seams of his leather boots, the places where his gloves met his sleeves. He stamped his feet, trying to force the blood back into his numb toes. The sound of his boots crunching against the frozen snow was the only noise in the world. He breathed out, and a thick plume of white vapor plumed from his lips, hanging in the still air for a moment before the wind tore it away. Noboru was thousands of miles from the world he knew. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the damp, gentle heat of his home in the south. He tried to remember the smell of the ocean, the soft green of the terraced hills, the chorus of cicadas in the late summer twilight. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. They were fading, bleached out by the blinding white of the snow. Inside the breast pocket of his heavy coat, resting just over his heart, was a letter. It had arrived on a supply train weeks ago, the paper thin and slightly crumpled. He knew the words by heart. He did not need to unfold it in the freezing wind to see his mother's careful, elegant handwriting. She wrote of simple things. The persimmon tree in their yard had borne heavy fruit. The neighbor's cat had had kittens. The village shrine needed a new roof before the spring rains. She did not ask about the empire. She did not ask about glory or conquest. She only asked if he was eating enough hot soup, and if he had remembered to wrap his scarf tightly around his neck. Every time Noboru felt the stiff crinkle of the paper through his wool coat, a sharp, profound ache bloomed in his chest. It was a homesickness so deep it felt like a physical wound. He looked down at the iron tracks, gleaming faintly under the pale winter moon. He had been told he was here on a grand mission, protecting the vital interests of his nation, bringing order and modernity to a wild frontier. But standing alone in the dark, shivering uncontrollably, he did not feel grand. He only felt small. He felt entirely alone, a fragile, frightened boy standing guard over a frozen ribbon of metal. Miles away, at the edge of a small, snow-drowned village, an older man named Shin sat quietly by a small hearth. The walls of his home were made of thick earth and straw, built to withstand the punishing breath of the winter. Outside, the stalks of the harvested sorghum poked through the deep snow like the broken bristles of an old brush. Shin was a man of the soil. His hands were deeply lined, mapped with the scars and calluses of a lifetime spent coaxing life from the stubborn earth. He sat on the edge of the warm brick bed, holding a steaming bowl of millet porridge in his hands. The heat from the bowl seeped into his palms, a small, profound comfort in the dark. Beside him, his young granddaughter slept soundly under a thick, patchwork quilt, her breath soft and rhythmic. Shin looked toward the window. It was covered in thick, translucent paper, but he could hear it. The low, rhythmic vibration that started deep in the earth, slowly rising into a heavy, metallic rumble. It was the night train. He watched as the light from the locomotive swept across the paper window, casting long, moving shadows across the walls of his small home. The train rushed past, a roaring beast of iron and fire, carrying coal, timber, and soldiers through the dark. Then, as quickly as it had arrived, the roar faded back into the howling wind, leaving the village in silence once more. Shin sighed, a long, tired exhalation that stirred the steam rising from his porridge. He remembered a time before the tracks. He remembered when the only sounds in the winter were the wind and the occasional bark of a wild dog. Then, the strangers had come with their measuring sticks and their heavy machines. They had sliced through the fields, laying down their iron roads, promising wealth and progress. But Shin knew that progress was a river that rarely flowed uphill to the farmer. He did not understand the politics whispered in the tea-houses or the shifting flags that seemed to change with the seasons. He only understood the land. And he knew that the land was becoming restless. The trains were running more frequently now, deep into the night. There were more young men in heavy wool coats holding rifles, their eyes darting nervously toward the tree lines. He felt no hatred for the young guards who sometimes walked the perimeter of his village. When he saw them, he only saw boys. Boys who were far from their mothers, boys who were shivering in a cold they were never meant to endure. Sometimes, when he was gathering firewood near the tracks, he would leave a small basket of roasted sweet potatoes near the crossing. He never stayed to watch who took them. It was a quiet, anonymous act of grace, an unspoken acknowledgement that, beneath the uniforms and the flags, they were all simply trying to survive the winter. And then came the night the air finally shattered. It was a night no different from the rest. The moon was a sliver of pale silver, the stars hard and bright in the freezing sky. Noboru was walking his patrol, his boots heavy, his mind drifting toward the warm hearth of his childhood home. Suddenly, a sound rolled across the plains. It was not the rhythmic chugging of a locomotive. It was a sharp, blunt thud, followed by a low, echoing rumble that vibrated through the soles of Noboru's boots. He stopped dead, his breath catching in his throat. He looked down the endless line of tracks. In the far distance, a faint plume of dark smoke began to smudge the pristine starlight. There were shouts in the dark. The frantic ringing of a telegraph bell from the small guard station. Noboru gripped his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white beneath his gloves. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He did not know what had happened. He did not know about the complex webs of provocation, the secret orders, the staged explosions designed to ignite a continent. He only knew that the fragile, frozen peace had cracked. In his earthen home, Shen woke with a start. The vibration had rattled the wooden beams of his roof. He sat up, pulling his heavy coat over his shoulders, and went to the paper window. He peeled back a small corner and looked out into the night. The village was still, but the horizon was alive. There was a strange, frantic energy in the air. Soon, the distant sound of engines grew louder. But these were not the passenger trains or the coal freighters. These were armored trains, dark and heavy, crawling along the tracks like iron beetles, bristling with the silhouettes of weapons. Shen watched them pass, his heart sinking with a heavy, ancient dread. He reached down and gently pulled the quilt higher around his sleeping granddaughter's shoulders. He knew, with the deep, quiet intuition of a man who watches the changing weather, that a terrible storm had finally arrived. It was not a storm of snow and wind, but a storm of men. The next morning, the sun rose pale and weak, casting long, blue shadows across the snowdrifts. Noboru stood on the platform of the station, surrounded by hundreds of other soldiers who had arrived in the night. They were packing gear, checking weapons, their faces tight with a mixture of fear and forced resolve. The orders had come down. They were to march forward. They were to secure the cities, secure the bridges, secure the entire vast, frozen expanse. He reached a trembling, gloved hand into his coat pocket and touched the crumpled edge of his mother's letter. He wanted to sit down in the snow and read it again. He wanted to close his eyes and smell the persimmons. But the whistle blew. The heavy boots began to march, a synchronized, crushing sound that drowned out the wind. Noboru joined the line, stepping forward into a future he could not see, swept away by a tide of history far too massive for a single boy to fight. A few miles away, Shen walked out into his snow-covered field. He carried a wooden shovel, moving slowly toward the place where he kept his winter stores buried beneath the frost. He paused and looked toward the tracks. The line of soldiers marching in the distance looked like a ribbon of dark ants moving across a white sheet. He stood there for a long time, leaning on the handle of his shovel, watching them disappear into the mist. He felt a profound, heavy sorrow. He sorrowed for the earth, which would soon be bruised by boots and tracks. He sorrowed for his village, which would have to bow its head and endure the coming winds. And, in a quiet, secret corner of his heart, he sorrowed for the shivering boys who were marching away from their homes, many of whom would simply dissolve into the vast, unforgiving snow, leaving nothing behind but unsent letters and fading memories of the spring. The wind picked up again, swirling the loose surface snow into the air like diamond dust. It blew across the tracks, slowly filling in the footprints, smoothing over the sharp edges of the iron, covering the earth in a cold, indifferent blanket of white. The winter did not care about the ambitions of empires. It only knew how to freeze, how to silence, and how to wait. Hunger is not a shout, it is a long, quiet shadow that stretches across the floorboards as the sun goes down. If you were to leave the glowing, electric streets of the city behind and travel deep into the mountains of rural Japan, you would find a world that moved at a profoundly different pace. Here, the landscape was a breathtaking tapestry of terraced hills and ancient pine forests, beautiful and silent under the heavy, gray sky. But it was a landscape that demanded everything from the people who lived upon it. The soil was a strict master, and the farmers who worked it were bound to its unforgiving rhythms. In one of these valleys, nestled near a rushing stream, stood a small farmhouse with a thatched roof, its edges softened by a recent dusting of snow. This was the home of a woman named Chio. Chio was not old, but her hands told the story of a lifetime of labor. They were rough, the skin cracked by icy water and stained by the dark earth. Yet, when she moved, there was a deep, quiet grace about her. Inside the farmhouse, the air was cold enough to see your breath. The only source of warmth was a small, square hearth sunk into the floor, where a few precious pieces of charcoal glowed with a faint, stubborn orange light. Chio knelt beside it, blowing gently on the embers, trying to coax enough heat to boil a black iron kettle. For generations, the people of this valley had survived by a delicate balance. They grew rice in the flooded paddies during the sweltering summer, and in the quiet, damp rooms of their homes, they raised silkworms. The silk was their salvation. It was the delicate, shimmering thread that tied their remote village to the vast, wealthy world across the ocean. The money from the silk buyers paid for winter coats, for medicine, for the seeds they would need in the spring. But the world across the ocean had suddenly closed its doors. The markets in distant, unimaginable cities had collapsed, and the elegant ladies in those faraway places no longer bought the shimmering fabric. Chio remembered the day the buyer from the city had come to the village. He had stood in the dusty square, shaking his head, his eyes avoiding the desperate faces of the farmers. He offered them pennies for months of exhausting, meticulous labor. It was a day the air seemed to leave the valley, replaced by a suffocating, invisible weight. In a back room of her house, the woven bamboo trays still sat, empty and silent. Chio remembered the sound the silkworms used to make when they ate the fresh mulberry leaves. It sounded exactly like a gentle, steady rain falling on a paper umbrella. It had been a comforting sound, the sound of safety. Now, the silence in that room was deafening. Without the silk money, the balance was broken. The rice harvest had been meager, the stalks battered by an early typhoon. And what little they had managed to pull from the mud did not belong to them. The landlord, a man who lived far away in a warm house, required his heavy share. The rent had to be paid, regardless of the storms, regardless of the silk, regardless of the empty bellies of the children. Chio stirred the pot hanging over the hearth. Inside, a thin, watery broth bubbled weakly. There was very little rice left in the wooden barrel. She had sliced a single, pale daikon radish as thin as she possibly could, letting the translucent discs float in the water to make the meal look like more than it was. She added a pinch of salt. That was all there was. The paper door slid open, and her husband, Kenzo, stepped inside. He left his muddy straw boots on the earthen floor of the entryway and stepped up onto the raised wooden boards. He brought the scent of the winter wind and wet bark with him. Kenzo was a strong man, broad-shouldered and quiet, but lately, Chio noticed how his clothes seemed to hang loosely from his frame. His cheekbones were sharp, casting deep shadows in the dim light of the room. He sat heavily beside the hearth, holding his raw, freezing hands out toward the fading coals. He did not speak. He did not have to. The exhaustion in his eyes said everything. He had been up on the mountain, cutting firewood, hoping to sell a few bundles in the neighboring town. But everyone was selling firewood. No one was buying. From the corner of the room, a soft rustling sound emerged from a pile of heavy quilts. Their two young daughters, Yuki and little May, were waking up from their afternoon nap. They tumbled out of the blankets, their cheeks pink from sleep, and ran to their father. Kenzo's face instantly softened. He wrapped his large, calloused arms around them, burying his face in their dark hair. For a moment, the crushing weight of the world was held at bay by the simple, profound warmth of his children. They sat together around the hearth for their evening meal. Chio carefully ladled the thin broth into wooden bowls. She made sure that the thickest pieces of radish and the very few grains of precious rice found their way into the bowls of her daughters. She handed a bowl to Kenzo, and then kept the smallest, most watery portion for herself. Kenzo looked down at his bowl, and then looked at his children. They were eating quickly, their small faces focused entirely on the warm broth. He took his chopsticks and, very quietly, transferred a small clump of rice from his own bowl into Yuki's. "I am not very hungry tonight," he whispered, offering his daughter a gentle, unconvincing smile. "I found a wild persimmon tree on the mountain today. I ate so many I can barely breathe. Yuki looked up, her eyes wide with delight, and quickly ate the extra rice. Chio looked down at her own lap, her vision blurring with sudden tears. She knew there were no persimmons on the mountain in the dead of winter. It was a lie born of pure, desperate love. It was the quiet, heartbreaking heroism of a father trying to shield his child from the sharp edges of poverty. This was the quiet desperation that blanketed thousands of villages across the nation. It was not a violent uprising. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of hope. Families were selling their ancestral lands just to buy a few sacks of flour. Some, driven to unimaginable extremes, were sending their teenage daughters away to work in the city's textile mills, tearing their families apart simply so the younger children might eat. When the bowls were empty and washed, and the girls were tucked back under the heavy quilts, asleep, Kenzo pulled a folded piece of paper from the inside pocket of his jacket. The paper was worn soft at the creases, as if it had been opened and closed 100 times. He smoothed it out on the low wooden table. Chio brought the small oil lamp closer, the flame flickering, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It was a pamphlet, printed with bold characters and a beautiful, sweeping illustration of a rising sun over endless, golden fields. It was an advertisement from the government, calling for pioneers. It spoke of a vast, open land across the sea. Manchuria. Kenzo traced the illustration of the wheat with his rough index finger. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper. They say the earth there is black and rich, he said, not looking at Chio, but staring deep into the paper. They say a man can claim as much land as he can plow. They say the harvests are so heavy the stalks bow down to the ground. Chio looked at the pamphlet. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine, a mixture of profound fear and an intoxicating, dangerous hope. It is a foreign land, Kenzo, she whispered back. It is very far. And there are people who already live there. Kenzo closed his eyes, leaning his forehead heavily on his hand. I know, he said, his voice thick with a sorrow he could not articulate. But what are we to do here, Chio? Look at our girls. Look at them. They are so small. The spring is coming, and I have no seeds to plant. The landlord will take the house by summer. If we stay, we will slowly fade away into the mud. He looked up at her, and the desperation in his eyes was absolute. The leaders in the city, they say this new land is the lifeline of our nation. They say our army is there to protect it, to protect us. If we go, if we follow the army, maybe Yuki and Mei can eat until they are full. Maybe they will never have to know the feeling of a completely empty bowl. This is how the grand, sweeping tragedies of history take root in the human heart. The people in the villages did not dream of conquest. They did not sit by their freezing hearths and wish for war, or glory, or the subjugation of a neighboring people. They did not have the energy for hatred. But when a government points toward a distant horizon and promises that salvation lies just across the water, when an empire renames an invasion as a rescue mission for its own starving children, the desperate heart begins to rationalize. To Kenzo and Chio, the soldiers marching in the newsreels were not conquerors. They were the vanguard of a harvest. They were the protectors of a future where a father would not have to lie about eating wild fruit in the snow. The massive, churning machinery of expansion was fueled not only by the ambition of generals, but by the profound, blinding panic of millions of parents who simply did not know how they were going to feed their children the next day. Chio reached across the low table and placed her small, rough hand over her husband's trembling fingers. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She simply held his hand in the dim, golden light of the lamp. Outside, the wind began to howl through the valley, rattling the wooden shutters of the old farmhouse. The snow fell harder, burying the empty, barren fields in a deep, indifferent white. The village slept, wrapped in the cold, dreaming of impossible, golden fields across the sea. And in the quiet dark, the weight of an empty rice bowl pressed down upon the scales of history, tipping a desperate nation closer and closer to the edge of an unfathomable abyss. The rain did not fall all at once. It arrived as a soft, continuous whisper that slowly changed the shape of the world. If you were to sit on the narrow wooden veranda of a home in Japan during the early summer, you would be wrapped in the heavy, warm embrace of the plum rains. The monsoon season is a time of deep, vibrant green, when the earth drinks until it can hold no more, and the air becomes so thick with moisture that it feels like breathing underwater. The sound of the rain is a constant, soothing companion. It drums a gentle rhythm on the dark clay tiles of the roof, it rustles through the broad leaves of the hydrangeas, and it overflows the stone basins in the garden, spilling down into the moss in 100 tiny, silver waterfalls. It is a season of quiet domesticity, when the dampness keeps people indoors, close to the hearth, sharing hushed conversations over steaming cups of roasted barley tea. But in the years leading up to the Great Darkness, the air inside those homes began to change. The shift was not sudden. It did not arrive with the blare of trumpets or the heavy, terrifying crash of boots on the paving stones. It came like the monsoon rain itself. It seeped into the soil. It soaked into the wooden beams. It drifted through the paper screens, invisible and pervasive, until there was not a single corner of life that remained untouched by its damp, heavy weight. This was the quiet, subtle machinery of a changing nation. The grand ideas of empire, of expansion, of a sacred destiny spreading across the continent, were not merely shouted by men in uniform from high balconies. Those shouts were too loud, too distant. True devotion is not built in the public square. It is built in the quiet sanctuary of the classroom, and at the low wooden tables where families share their evening rice. Imagine a schoolhouse built of dark, weathered cedar, nestled at the edge of a small provincial town. Inside, the air smells of wet chalk, damp wool uniforms, and the sweet, woody scent of freshly sharpened pencils. In the second row sits a boy named Akira. He is 10 years old, with hair that never quite lays flat and a permanent smudge of ink on the side of his hand. He is a gentle child, the kind who carefully steps around the trails of ants on the dirt path and who spends his afternoons watching the clouds change shape over the mountains. At the front of the room stands his teacher, Mr. Sato. Mr. Sato is an older man, his hair dusted with white, his shoulders carrying a perpetual, soft slope of weariness. He has taught in this very room for over 20 years. He remembers a time when he stood before the blackboard and read the children ancient poems about the moon reflecting in a still pond, or folk tales about mischievous foxes and brave, kind-hearted woodcutters. But the books on his desk have changed. The covers are now stark and serious. Mr. Sato opens the new reader, the binding stiff and unfamiliar in his hands. He looks out at the rows of young faces, their eyes wide and completely trusting. He clears his throat, fighting a sudden, inexplicable tightness in his chest. He begins to read aloud, not of foxes or the moon, but of legendary warriors who threw themselves into the sea rather than face surrender. He reads of absolute loyalty, of a purity of spirit that demands unquestioning sacrifice. He reads that their island nation is a divine family, surrounded by a chaotic, envious world, and that it is the sacred duty of every child to grow up strong, unyielding, and ready to protect the emperor's grand vision. Akira listens, his chin resting in his hands. The words are like a new kind of music, a steady, hypnotic drumbeat that makes his small heart swell with a strange, heavy pride. He does not understand the politics of it. He does not know what lies across the sea. He only knows that Mr. Sato's voice sounds very solemn, and that to be good, to be loved, he must be brave like the men in the stories. Behind his desk, Mr. Sato lowers the book. He watches Akira, and he watches the other boys, sitting up a little straighter, their small faces setting into masks of practiced seriousness. A profound, quiet sorrow washes over the old teacher. He knows what he is doing. He is a kind man, a man who loves these children as if they were his own, yet he is the instrument gently pouring the iron into their souls. He feels trapped by a momentum he cannot stop. If he does not teach the new curriculum, he will be replaced by someone who will teach it with cruelty rather than sorrow. And so, he tries to balance the scales in the only, tiny ways he can. When the bell rings and the children rush out into the damp, misty playground, Mr. Sato walks slowly down the aisle. He stops at Akira's desk. From his own pocket, he pulls a small, worn book of very old, silly fairy tales. He slips it beneath Akira's wooden pencil box, completely out of sight. It is a silent apology. It is a desperate, hidden prayer that the boy might keep just a single, small piece of his gentle imagination safe from the encroaching storm. Outside in the schoolyard, the rain has paused, leaving behind a world painted in slick, reflective gray. In the past, the children would have run to the muddy edges of the field to catch frogs, or played elaborate games of hide-and-seek among the cedar trees. But the games have changed. Akira and his friends gather in the center of the yard. They pick up long, straight sticks of fallen bamboo. They line up, shoulder to shoulder. The baker's son, a boy barely taller than Akira, steps to the front and shouts a command. The boys raise their bamboo sticks to their shoulders like rifles. They march in unison through the puddles, their small boots splashing water, chanting the songs they learned that morning. It is play, but it is play stripped of innocence. They are practicing for a war they cannot comprehend, their young minds slowly being molded into the shape of a weapon. And the tragedy is that they are so very beautiful in their earnestness. They want nothing more than to be good, to be brave, to be part of the grand story their nation is telling itself. When the afternoon light begins to fade, turning the thick clouds a bruised, purplish hue, Akira walks home under a waxed paper umbrella. The rain has returned, falling in a steady, hushed curtain. He arrives at his house, sliding open the wooden door and stepping into the entryway. The smell of simmering miso and roasted root vegetables fills the air, a scent so comforting and familiar it immediately unties the knots in his shoulders. His mother, Noriko, kneels on the tatami mat, folding laundry. She looks up and smiles, a soft, warm light in her eyes. She takes his damp coat, brushing her hand gently against his cold cheek. They sit together at the low dining table as the evening deepens. Akira opens his sketchbook. In the past, the pages of this book were filled with chaotic, joyful scribbles of beetles, mountains, and the stray cats that wandered through their garden. Noriko loved to watch him draw, loving the soft, curving lines of his imagination. But tonight, as she brings a steaming pot of tea to the table, she looks over his shoulder and her breath catches softly in her throat. Akira's hands, smudged with dark charcoal, are pressing hard into the paper. He is drawing a battleship. The lines are heavy, sharp, and rigid. He draws massive guns pointing toward an unseen horizon. He draws dark, billowing smoke rising into the sky. He draws tiny, stick-figure men standing on the deck, rigid and uniform. "What are you drawing, my little one?" Noriko asks, her voice trembling just a fraction. "It is the fleet, mother," Akira says, not looking up, his focus absolute. "The teacher says they are the iron walls of our home. I am going to build them when I am big." Noriko looks at the drawing. She looks at the harsh, violent lines created by her gentle son's hands. She feels a sudden, piercing chill that has nothing to do with the dampness of the monsoon. It is the chill of a mother realizing that the world is reaching into her quiet house and claiming her child. Later, her husband returns from the municipal office where he works. They eat their simple meal in relative silence. In the corner of the room, a small wooden radio is turned on, tuned low. It plays the new, rousing marches, interspersed with crisp, bright voices reading the news. The voices speak of borders expanding, of destiny, of the sacred mission across the sea. The tone is always triumphant, always certain. Across the small table, Noriko meets her husband's eyes. It is a fleeting, agonizingly vulnerable glance. They do not speak a word of dissent. The walls are thin, and the atmosphere in the town has grown suspicious of those who do not smile brightly enough at the news of victory. But in that single, shared look, an entire volume of grief is spoken. They see what is happening to their boy. They see the gentle slope of his childhood being flattened and paved over. They are terrified. They are terrified of the dark, hungry machine that is demanding the hearts of their children, and they are terrified of what will happen to Akira if he is sent to walk across that distant, foreign soil. But they are trapped in the current. To resist is to invite ruin upon the family. To speak out is to become a pariah. And so, they do what millions of parents do in the face of an overwhelming, slow-moving tragedy. They bow their heads. They pour the tea. They try to make the rice stretch a little further. They try to find small, hidden moments to simply love their son before the world takes him away completely. When Akira is finally asleep, tucked beneath his heavy quilts, Noriko sits by the dim glow of a single paper lantern. She takes his school uniform jacket in her lap. A button has come loose. She threads a needle with dark cotton thread. She works slowly, the house completely silent except for the rhythmic, endless sound of the rain washing over the eaves. With every stitch, she sews a silent prayer into the fabric. She prays for peace. She prays for the rain to wash away the iron and the charcoal. She prays that her son will never have to learn the true, terrible weight of the rifle he mimics with a bamboo stick. The nationalism that eventually drove an empire across the sea was not born in a single day. It was not a sudden fever. It was built stitch by stitch, lesson by lesson, meal by meal. It was a tragedy woven from the purest of human desires, the desire of a child to be brave, the desire of a teacher to survive, the desire of a family to belong. And all the while, the monsoon rain continued to fall softly in the dark, a gentle, whispering tide that was slowly, irreversibly, drowning the world they once knew. Even the brightest paper lantern cannot entirely banish the shadow that waits just beyond the edge of the light. If you were to wander into a small, riverside village in the heart of China as the first breath of spring tried to push away the winter chill, you would find a world bathed in a soft, crimson glow. It is the 15th day of the first lunar month, the night of the Lantern Festival. For centuries, this night has marked the end of the New Year's celebrations, a time when the darkness of the long winter is pushed back by thousands of flickering candles, and the air is filled with the sweet, comforting scent of steamed glutinous rice. The village rests along a winding canal, its ancient stone bridges arching gracefully over water that moves as slow and dark as molasses. Along the cobblestone paths, hanging beneath the wide wooden eaves of the tea houses and the family homes, are the lanterns. They are made of delicate, translucent paper and stretched over thin frames of bamboo. Some are simple, glowing orbs of red and gold, others are painted with elegant brushstrokes, depicting koi fish swimming upstream or lotus flowers blooming in the mud. In the crisp evening air, these little fires seem to hold a magic all their own. They cast long, dancing shadows on the stone walls, making the ancient village feel like a living, breathing creature. Inside a small, timber-framed house near the edge of the water, the air is thick with steam and warmth. Grandmother Lin stands at a heavy wooden table, her sleeves rolled up, her hands dusted with fine, white rice flour. She is a woman whose face is mapped with the lines of many seasons, a face that holds the quiet, enduring strength of the earth itself. Beside her stands her young granddaughter, May, barely tall enough to see over the edge of the table. Together, they are making tang yuan, the sweet, round dumplings that are the heart of the festival. Grandmother Lin moves with a practiced, rhythmic grace. She takes a small pinch of the snowy dough, rolls it into a perfect sphere between her palms, makes a small indentation, and fills it with a paste of crushed black sesame seeds and sugar. Then, she seals it, rolling it once more until it is smooth and flawless. "Remember, little bird," Grandmother Lin whispers, her voice as soft as the flour on her hands. "We make them round because the family must be round. Wholeness. Unity. No matter how far the wind blows our leaves, the roots remain together. May nods solemnly, her small hands clumsy but eager as she tries to mimic her grandmother's motions. It is a beautiful, intimate moment, a profound passing of tradition from one generation to the next. But if you look closely at Grandmother Lin's eyes, beneath the warmth and the gentle smile, there is a quiet, hidden ache. There are 2 empty chairs at the wooden table this year. Her eldest son and his wife had traveled north to the great city of Beijing many months ago to find work in the textile markets. They had promised to return before the winter snows. But the snows had come, and the snows had melted, and the only thing that had traveled down from the north were rumors. Grandmother Lin gently drops the dumplings into a pot of boiling water. She watches them sink to the bottom, waiting for them to rise, a sign that they are ready to be eaten. She does not speak of her fears to little May. She does not speak of the hushed conversations she overheard at the vegetable market that morning. But the fear is there, a cold, heavy stone sitting at the bottom of her stomach. Outside, the festival is underway, but the music feels different this year. Usually, the village square would be a riot of sound, crashing cymbals, the loud, joyful popping of firecrackers, the roaring laughter of the dragon dancers. But tonight, the celebration is subdued. The people of the village go through the motions of their ancient traditions, but they are secretly holding their breath. Along the stone bridge, groups of men stand smoking pipes, the glowing embers illuminating their deeply furrowed brows. They are not talking about the harvest, or the price of silk, or the changing weather. They are talking in low, guarded whispers about the railway lines. Old Wang, the village apothecary, leans in close to a traveling merchant who has just arrived from a northern province. "Is it true?" Old Wang asks, his voice barely audible over the sound of the flowing canal. "Are the northern gates truly closed?" The merchant looks around nervously, pulling his heavy, wool coat tighter against his chest. "I saw it with my own eyes," he murmurs, staring down at the dark water. The trains heading north are empty of people, but heavy with iron. The trains heading south, they are overflowing with families carrying everything they own on their backs. The soldiers from the island nation, they are no longer just in Manchuria. They are building garrisons closer to the ancient wall. You can feel the earth trembling before you even hear their engines. Old Wang slowly nods, taking a long, slow pull from his pipe. He looks out over the village, at the children running with their sparklers, at the glowing paper lanterns reflecting in the canal. It feels as though they are all living inside a beautiful, fragile glass snow globe, and someone, somewhere in the dark, has just picked up a hammer. The people in the countryside do not need to read the complex political treatises of foreign diplomats to understand what is happening. They are people of the seasons. They know how to read the sky before a typhoon breaks. And the sky in the north is turning a terrifying, bruised shade of black. A few streets away, walking slowly beneath the hanging lanterns, is a young schoolteacher named Mr. Chen. He is a gentle man with round spectacles and a woolen scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. He carries a small bundle of incense to burn at the local temple, but his mind is miles away. Inside the breast pocket of his coat, resting heavy against his heart, is a letter. It arrived 2 days ago from a dear friend, a fellow scholar who teaches literature at a university in the old northern capital. Mr. Chen has read the letter so many times he has memorized the shape of the ink on the page. His friend had not written of politics, but of poetry and packing boxes. "My dear Chen," the letter read, "we are spending our evenings wrapping the ancient library scrolls in waxed paper and placing them into heavy wooden crates. The university feels like a tomb. We are told we may need to move the entire school inland, far to the west, into the mountains. Can you imagine? Carrying 1,000 years of history on our backs to hide it from the guns. I looked out my window this morning and saw sandbags stacked against the ancient stone lions of the city gates. We are still readingly by in the classroom, but the students are distracted. They are listening to the sky. We are all just listening, waiting for the storm to break." Mr. Chen stops walking and leans against the cold stone railing of the canal. He watches a tiny, paper lotus lantern float by on the water, its small candle fighting bravely against the draft. He looks at the people around him. He sees a mother wiping a smudge of dirt from her toddler's cheek. He sees an old man carefully pouring a cup of warm rice wine for his neighbor. He sees the profound, simple beauty of an ordinary life trying desperately to continue. He feels an overwhelming surge of love for these people, for their resilience, for their quiet dignity. And with that love comes a devastating, paralyzing sorrow. He knows that the men in the distant island empire do not see the mother, or the old man, or the child. They see a map. They see resources. They see a space to be conquered, a manifest destiny written in steel and blood. He wants to shout to the village, to tell them to pack their belongings, to run toward the safety of the western mountains before it is too late. But where would they go? How does a farmer pack up the soil that has held his ancestors' bones for 500 years? How does Grandmother Lin leave the house where her children took their first steps? They cannot run. They can only endure. And so, Mr. Chen does the only thing he can do. He walks to the temple, its grand wooden doors open to the night, the air inside thick with the heady, fragrant smoke of sandalwood. He kneels on the worn, woven mat before the golden statue of the Buddha. He lights his incense, the thin tendrils of smoke rising toward the shadowed ceiling. He does not pray for victory in a war that has not yet officially begun. He does not pray for the destruction of the enemy. He simply prays for mercy. He prays that the paper lanterns will be enough to guide the lost souls home. He prays that the innocent will find a place to hide when the iron rains down. Back in the small timber house, Grandmother Lin places a steaming bowl of sweet tang yuan on the table. Little May climbs into her chair, her eyes wide with anticipation. She takes a careful bite, the warm, sweet sesame paste filling her mouth, and a brilliant, pure smile spreads across her face. Grandmother Lin sits across from her, holding her own warm bowl in her tired hands. She looks at the empty chairs, and then she looks at her granddaughter. This is why they still light the lanterns. This is why they still boil the sweet rice. It is not ignorance of the gathering dark. It is an act of profound, quiet defiance. It is a declaration that even in the shadow of an encroaching empire, their culture, their love, their family, will not simply surrender to the night. They will continue to live, to hope, to find sweetness in the bitter cold, for as long as they possibly can. As the night deepens, the festival slowly begins to wind down. The sound of footsteps on the cobblestones grows sparse. The heavy wooden doors of the houses are pulled shut, barred against the chill. Outside, the candles within the paper lanterns begin to burn low. One by one, they flicker, gasp for air, and finally fade into smoke. The vibrant reds and golds recede, swallowed by the natural, encompassing dark of the rural night. The village sleeps, bathed in the pale, cold light of the winter moon. The canal continues its slow, silent journey toward the sea. The people are wrapped in their heavy quilts, holding their loved ones close, dreaming of the spring that is trying so hard to arrive. But high above the clouds, carried on the shifting, restless wind, comes the faint, distant sound of an engine. It is just a whisper, a vibration in the atmosphere, easily mistaken for the rumble of distant thunder. But the storm that is coming is not made of rain. The light of the Lantern Festival has faded. The ancient, quiet world is holding its breath in the dark, entirely unaware that the morning sun, when it finally rises, will bring with it a fire that will change the face of the earth forever. History does not always break with a roar. Sometimes, it shatters in the panic dark, triggered by the trembling hand of a frightened boy. If you were to stand by the muddy banks of the winding river on that heavy, breathless summer night, you would feel the weight of the air long before you saw the water. It is the deep, suffocating middle of the season, a time when the humidity rests upon the skin like a warm, damp woolen blanket. The sky is an impenetrable canopy of bruised indigo, entirely devoid of stars, threatening a thunderstorm that refuses to break and offer relief. The only sound is the deafening, rhythmic chorus of the cicadas hidden in the tall, swaying reeds, singing their ancient song to the dark. Spanning the slow, sluggish water is a magnificent bridge of pale stone. It is a masterpiece of a bygone age, a sweeping, graceful structure consisting of 11 beautiful arches. Lining the stone parapets are hundreds of carved lions, no two exactly alike. Some are fierce, some are playful, some hide tiny stone cubs beneath their heavy paws. For centuries, these silent guardians have watched merchants, monks, and emperors cross the river. They have worn smooth under the touch of millions of passing hands, their faces weathered by endless seasons of rain and sun. They are monuments to patience, enduring the slow, turning wheel of time. But tonight, the bridge does not connect two shores. It separates two worlds of profound, exhausting fear. Hidden in the tall, coarse grass on one side of the riverbank is a young man named Haruto. He is far, far from home, swallowed by a landscape that feels vast and completely indifferent to his existence. He wears a thick, heavy cotton uniform that is entirely unsuited for the oppressive summer heat. His collar is soaked with sweat, and his skin is mapped with the irritating, angry bites of relentless mosquitoes. Haruto is not a warrior of legend. He is not a conqueror driven by the fiery speeches of politicians in distant, comfortable offices. He is just a boy, barely old enough to grow a beard, who should be standing knee-deep in a cool, rushing stream back in his mountain village, helping his father wash the dirt from the freshly harvested radishes. Instead, he is lying on his stomach in the foreign mud, his fingers gripping the polished wood of a heavy rifle he barely knows how to use. His commanding officers have ordered night maneuvers, a confusing, chaotic exercise in the pitch black. Haruto does not understand the grand strategy. He does not understand the shifting borders or the complex treaties that have dragged him across the ocean. He only knows that his legs ache with a dull, throbbing pain, and that his eyes are so heavy he has to blink furiously just to keep them open. As he stares out into the wall of darkness, he desperately tries to retreat into his own mind to find a sliver of comfort. He thinks of his younger sister, who cried and held onto his sleeve at the train station. He thinks of the small, embroidered pouch hidden in his breast pocket, containing a pinch of earth from his family's garden and a folded paper crane. He presses his hand against his chest, feeling the soft lump of the pouch through the thick fabric. It is his tether to the world he knows, a world that makes sense, a world that is quiet and safe. He closes his eyes for just a second, letting out a long, shaky breath, wishing with every fiber of his being that he could simply dissolve into the warm night air and drift back across the sea to his mother's kitchen. On the other side of the sluggish water, resting his cheek against a rough burlap sack filled with damp earth, is another young man named Jian. Jian is a defender of the bridge, placed behind a hastily constructed barricade of sandbags and wooden crates. He is a local boy, a child of the surrounding fields. He knows this river intimately. He knows how it smells when the rains come, a rich scent of turned soil and crushed green leaves. When he was a little boy, he used to run barefoot across the smooth stones of the bridge, playing hide-and-seek among the carved lions, laughing as the summer sun warmed his back. Now, the bridge of his childhood has become a terrifying frontier. Jian peers over the top of the sandbags, his eyes straining against the absolute blackness of the opposite bank. He knows the strangers are out there in the grass. He can hear the faint, metallic clinking of their equipment, the muffled snaps of broken twigs under heavy boots. The sounds make his heart hammer wildly against his ribs. Jian does not harbor a deep, burning hatred for the men in the dark. He is simply exhausted by the tension. For weeks, the atmosphere has been stretched tight, like a string on an instrument pulled far past its breaking point. He is tired of the waiting. He is tired of jumping at every sudden noise. His stomach rumbles, a hollow, echoing ache, reminding him that he has only eaten a small bowl of watery millet all day. He shifts his weight, wincing as a cramp seizes his calf. He looks down at his hands, calloused from years of gripping a farmer's hoe, now tightly wrapped around the cold iron of a weapon. He wants nothing more than to lay his head down on the damp sandbags and surrender to sleep. He wants to wake up to the sound of the village roosters, to smell the sweet smoke of a cooking fire, to walk out into a peaceful field and feel the sun on his face. He wants the strangers to pack up their heavy bags and go back to their homes, so he can go back to his. They are two boys, separated by a few hundred yards of slow-moving water, entirely blind to one another. If they were to meet in a sunlit town square, they might have traded a shy smile, or shared a sweet rice cake, or complained together about the oppressive summer heat. But in the dark, stripped of their individuality by the heavy uniforms they wear, they are nothing but formless terrors to one another. And then, the suffocating silence of the night is broken. It is not a grand, orchestrated attack. It does not begin with a roaring battle cry. It is simply a sudden, sharp noise in the dark. Perhaps it is a nervous finger slipping on a trigger. Perhaps it is a misfire. Perhaps it is just a heavy branch snapping under the weight of an unfamiliar boot. In the bright light of day, it would be nothing. But in the anxious, terrified pitch-black of the night, it is a spark falling into a room full of dry paper. A rumor ripples frantically down the line of Japanese soldiers hidden in the grass. A whisper, terrified and urgent, passes from boy to boy. Someone is missing. One of their own did not return from the shadows. The officers shout commands, their voices cracking with a mixture of authority and sudden panic. Haruto's heart leaps into his throat. He scrambles to his knees, his hands shaking so violently he can barely hold his rifle. He cannot see his friends. He cannot see his officers. He can only see the terrifying, impenetrable wall of the night. On the bridge, Jien hears the sudden commotion on the opposite bank. He hears the shouts, the metallic clatter of bolts being thrown. The fear is a physical thing, a cold wave washing over his tired body. He presses himself flat against the sandbags, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The boy next to him, a teenager whose name Jien doesn't even know, begins to weep softly, a quiet, desperate sound that breaks Jien's heart. And then, a flash of light tears through the dark. It is followed by the sharp, terrifying crack of a rifle. It is not aimed. It is not calculated. It is a desperate, blind reaction born of pure, unadulterated terror. A boy in the grass, utterly convinced he is about to be swallowed by the shadows, pulls his trigger. The spark leaps across the water, illuminating the pale stone of the bridge for a fraction of a second. Instantly, the tension snaps. The fear takes over, contagious and absolute. More sparks flash in the grass. The bullets whistle through the humid air, striking the ancient stone of the bridge with dull, heavy thuds. Behind the sandbags, Jien ducks his head, covering his ears. He is terrified. He wants his mother. He wants to be anywhere but here. But the instinct to survive overrides everything else. Trembling uncontrollably, he raises his own rifle over the barricade and fires back blindly into the void. Sparks beneath the stone arches. Flashes of amber and gold reflecting in the sluggish water below. It is a terrible, chaotic display. It is not a battle of titans, it is a profound, tragic misunderstanding between terrified children who have been placed in the dark and told that the shadows are full of monsters. Haruto lies flat in the mud, crying silently, the dirt mixing with the sweat and tears on his cheeks. He does not want to hurt anyone. He just wants the noise to stop. He clutches his chest, feeling the small embroidered pouch against his heart, praying to a God he hopes is listening to simply let him live until the morning. Jien crouches behind the ancient stone lions, his eyes squeezed tightly shut. He listens to the chaotic popping of the rifles, the sound drowning out the cicadas, drowning out the slow movement of the river. He feels a profound, crushing sorrow, because he knows, with the deep intuition of someone who loves their home, that the quiet world he knew is gone forever. The skirmish does not last long. The ammunition runs low, the initial panic subsides into a tense, agonizing standoff, and the heavy darkness rushes back in to swallow the flashes of light. But the damage is done. The spark has caught. The great tragedy of the moment is not found in grand historical declarations, but in the tragic simplicity of what has just occurred. A handful of scared, exhausted boys, manipulated by the massive, churning gears of empires, have accidentally set the world on fire because they were too afraid to simply call out to one another in the dark. As the night stretches on, returning to a terrifying, watchful silence, the ancient stone lions of the bridge sit perfectly still. They do not judge. They do not weep. They simply bear witness to the folly of men, to the sorrow of the children forced to carry the weight of nations on their fragile, trembling shoulders. Below them, the river continues its slow, indifferent journey toward the sea, carrying the echoes of the sparks, carrying the quiet, desperate tears of the boys in the grass and the boys behind the sandbags, flowing endlessly through a world that will never, ever be the same again. A house cannot weep when it is left behind, so the sky must do it instead. If you were to stand in the center of a small, northern farming village just days after the world broke apart, you would feel a heavy, damp silence pressing down upon the earth. The oppressive summer heat had finally broken, but the relief was stolen by a thick, bruised canopy of clouds that rolled in from the horizon. A fine, misty rain had begun to fall, dusting the curved clay tiles of the rooftops and turning the dry, yellow dust of the courtyards into a slippery, dark mud. For generations, the sound of rain in this valley was a blessing. It was the sweet, rhythmic promise of a good harvest, the sound that lulled children to sleep, safe beneath their heavy woven blankets. But today, the rain carried a different melody. It was a cold, gray curtain falling over a world that was suddenly, incomprehensibly ending. Beneath the steady patter of the raindrops, if you listened very closely, you could hear another sound. It was a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to travel through the deep roots of the ancient trees and vibrate in the soles of your feet. It sounded like the rolling thunder of the approaching storm, a deep, muffled thudding just beyond the edge of the hills. But the elders in the village, men and women who had watched the sky for 80 years, knew the difference between the thunder of the heavens and the thunder of men. The storm that was coming was made of iron and fire, and it was moving toward them with a terrifying, indifferent momentum. In a modest courtyard near the edge of the village, a young mother named Li Hua stood before a small, wooden handcart. The cart was frail, its wooden wheels worn smooth by years of carrying nothing heavier than bundles of cabbage and dry firewood. Now, it was being asked to carry the entire weight of a family's existence. Li Hua's hands were trembling, though she tried desperately to hide it from her children. She held a beautifully embroidered silk blanket, a wedding gift that had been stitched by her grandmother's own hands. It was the color of a deep, twilight blue, woven with silver threads that formed the shapes of flying cranes. It was the most beautiful thing she owned. She held it against her chest, feeling the soft, cool fabric beneath her chin, closing her eyes for just a moment to remember the peaceful days before the air turned sour with fear. But a cart has no room for sentiment when survival is the only destination. With a quiet, breaking heart, Li Hua gently folded the silk blanket and carried it back inside the house, placing it carefully inside a cedar chest. She could not take it. The silk would not keep them warm when the autumn winds began to howl. It would not fill their stomachs when they were walking along unfamiliar roads. Instead, she returned to the cart with heavy, rough-spun wool blankets, bags of dried millet, a cast-iron cooking pot, and a small sack of precious salt. Packing a life into a single cart is an agonizing arithmetic. Every object is a memory, an anchor to the earth, a testament that you existed in this place. To leave a carved wooden chair behind is to leave the memory of sitting by the fire on a winter night. To leave a porcelain teacup is to leave the memory of a quiet conversation with a neighbor. Li Hua touched the wooden doorframe of her home, her fingers lingering on the grain of the wood. She was not just packing bags, she was systematically unspooling her identity, tearing up the deep, invisible roots that tied her to this soil. Across the courtyard, sitting on a low wooden stool beneath the overhanging eaves, was her father-in-law, Grandfather Wei. He was a man made of quiet dignity, his face lined like the bark of the old willow tree that guarded the village well. He watched the rain fall into the puddles, his eyes cloudy with a sorrow so deep it had no words. On his lap rested a small, intricately carved wooden box. Inside this box were the ancestral tablets of his family. Small, upright pieces of polished wood bearing the names of his father, his grandfather, and the generations that stretched back into the mists of time. This house, this specific patch of earth, was where their spirits resided. It was where incense was burned, where respect was paid, where the continuity of their bloodline was honored. How does a man pack up his ancestors? How does he explain to the ghosts of his fathers that he is abandoning the shrine they built with their own hands? Grandfather Wei slowly opened the box. The smell of old sandalwood drifted up, sweet and melancholic. He reached out with a trembling, calloused finger and traced the carved characters of his own father's name. He remembered the day his father had taught him how to plant seeds in the spring, how to read the clouds, how to be a good man. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped his eye and fell onto the polished wood. He knew he could not take the heavy wooden shrine. He could only take the spirits within his own heart. Very gently, he closed the box and wrapped it in a piece of oiled paper to protect it from the rain. He tucked it deep into the inner pocket of his heavy coat, placing it directly over his heart. He would carry them with him. He would be the walking temple of his family. He stood up slowly, his joints aching in the damp air, and walked toward his daughter-in-law. He placed a gentle hand on Li Hua's shoulder. She stopped packing the cart, her shoulders slumping as she finally let out a quiet, muffled sob. Grandfather Wei did not say that everything would be all right, because he was a wise man, and he knew it would not be. He simply stood beside her in the rain, offering the quiet, enduring strength of his presence. "The roots of a tree are not in the dirt," he whispered softly, his voice barely audible over the patter of the rain. "The roots are in the seed. We are the seed now, Li Hua. We carry the soil within us." At the gate of their courtyard, little Jian, Li Hua's 5-year-old son, stood holding a small, carved wooden horse. He did not understand the thunder in the distance. He did not understand why his mother was crying, or why his grandfather looked so incredibly old today. He only knew that the house was empty, the fire was out, and his favorite climbing tree was being left behind. A neighbor, Auntie Chen, hurried past their gate, pulling her own small cart through the mud. She was a woman who had always been known for her sharp tongue and her meticulous garden, but today, her face was soft and pale with fear. She saw little Jian standing by the gate, looking lost and small in the gray morning. Auntie Chen stopped. The rain was soaking through her thin shawl, and her own cart was terrifyingly light, holding barely enough food for a week. Yet, she reached into a small woven basket hanging from her cart and pulled out a single, perfectly preserved dried persimmon. It was a luxury, a tiny piece of sweet comfort saved for a special occasion. She knelt in the mud, regardless of her clothes, and pressed the sweet fruit into Jian's small hand. She offered him a brave, trembling smile, a profound act of everyday heroism in a world that was rapidly losing its humanity. She didn't speak a word, she just touched his cold cheek and hurried on, joining the slow, tragic procession beginning to form on the main road. By midday, the village was emptying. It was a quiet, somber exodus. There was no panic, no shouting, only the devastatingly sad sound of wooden wheels grinding through the wet earth, the soft splashing of footsteps, and the relentless, whispering rain. The road leading south out of the valley was choked with a river of humanity. Hundreds of carts, laden with the meager remnants of ancient lives, rolled slowly forward, pulled by men, women, and even the older children. They walked with their heads bowed against the wind, their faces hidden beneath wide bamboo hats or pieces of waxed paper. They looked like a procession of ghosts, a silent tide of refugees being swept away by an invisible, terrifying current. Li Hua pulled the wooden handles of her cart, her hands raw and blistered. Grandfather Wei walked beside her, leaning heavily on a walking stick, his free hand resting protectively over the pocket that held his ancestors. Little Jian sat atop the pile of blankets in the cart, eating his sweet persimmon, entirely unaware of the historical tragedy he was a part of. As they reached the crest of the hill that looked down upon the valley, the procession naturally, instinctively paused. They turned around to look at their home one last time. The village sat nestled in the curve of the river, looking exactly as it had for hundreds of years. The curved roofs, the narrow alleyways, the ancient willow tree by the well, it was all there, wrapped in the soft, gray mist of the falling rain. From a distance, it looked perfectly peaceful. It looked like a painting. But suddenly, the distant thunder rolled again, louder this time. The earth trembled beneath their worn shoes. A flash of light, dull and orange, bloomed over the northern hills, illuminating the bruised underbelly of the clouds. It was followed moments later by a sharp, cracking boom that echoed through the valley, echoing off the stone walls of the houses they had just abandoned. Li Hua gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Grandfather Wei simply closed his eyes and gripped his walking stick tighter. The storm had breached the hills. The abstract fear had become a physical, terrifying reality. In the village below, the rain continued to fall. It fell on the empty courtyards. It fell on the abandoned plows rusting in the fields. It fell on the beautiful, shattered clay tiles of the rooftops, washing away the dust of 1,000 days of peace. Li Hua turned away from the valley. She faced the muddy, winding road that stretched out endlessly toward the south, toward the mountains, toward a destination she could not see and a future she could not imagine. She adjusted her grip on the wooden handles of the cart. She took a deep breath of the cold, wet air, pulling the cart forward into the mud. They walked into the rain, a single, fragile family amidst a sea of the uprooted, carrying nothing but a few blankets, a carved wooden box, and the quiet, stubborn resilience of the human heart, hoping only to find a quiet place where the sky did not sound like falling iron, and where the rain could finally be just rain again. The heaviest burden a soldier carries is never forged of iron, it is made of thin paper and silent words. If you were to walk through a makeshift encampment on the vast, sweeping plains of the continent, long after the sun had dipped below the horizon, you would find a world entirely drained of its martial glory. In the daylight, this was a place of stiff uniforms, sharp commands, and the heavy, synchronized marching of an empire on the move. But in the deep, quiet hours of the night, when the officers were asleep and the wind howled across the dry earth, the illusion faded. The grand, invincible army dissolved, leaving behind only thousands of lonely, exhausted boys wrapped in damp wool, trying desperately to stay warm. Inside the dim, canvas tents, small islands of amber light flickered against the dark. These were the glow of solitary candles, shielded carefully from the draft by cupped, trembling hands. And sitting beside these fragile flames, hunched over their knees, were the soldiers. They were not cleaning their rifles. They were not studying maps. They were writing. To understand the true nature of this invasion, you must look away from the grand speeches of the politicians and the proud banners waving in the capital. You must look, instead, over the shoulder of a conscripted youth in the middle of the night, watching the scratch of a cheap metal nib across a piece of rough, fibrous paper. The military provided official postcards for the men to send home. They were neatly printed with pre-approved phrases. I am in high spirits. The mission is glorious. We are bringing peace to the continent. All a soldier had to do was sign his name. But the human heart is too vast and too heavy to be contained within a pre-printed lie. And so, the boys found their own paper. They tore blank pages from the backs of military manuals. They smoothed out the wrapping from their rations. They traded precious cigarettes for a small bottle of watered-down ink. And in the quiet dark, they wrote the letters they knew they could never, ever send. They knew the censors would read every word that went through the military post. They knew that any expression of doubt, any whisper of fear, any admission of sorrow would be blacked out with heavy ink, or worse, bring shame and consequence upon their families back home. So, these letters were not written for the mailbag. They were written purely for survival. They were a secret sanctuary, a quiet room in the mind where a boy could lay down his weapon and simply be a son, a brother, a husband, once more. Imagine a boy named Yuri. He is 19 years old, with hands that are broad and rough from working the terraced sweet potato fields of his mountainous home. He sits with his back against a wooden supply crate, a makeshift desk across his lap. His uniform is too large for him, the heavy collar chafing his sunburned neck. He dips his pen into the ink. He is writing to his mother. He does not write about the grand, strategic movements of the army. He writes about the smell of the earth. He tells her that the soil here is different, a fine, yellow dust that gets into everything, so unlike the rich, dark mud of their mountain valley. He writes that he misses the sound of the rain on their thatched roof. He tells her how he closed his eyes during the march today and tried to remember the exact taste of the pickled plums she used to pack in his lunch when he walked to the village school. And then, his handwriting slows. The characters become smaller, more hesitant. He writes of the people he has seen. The propaganda posters in the city had painted the continent as a vast, empty wilderness waiting to be cultivated, or a chaotic land begging to be civilized by their glorious empire. But Yuri writes of a different reality. He writes of walking through a ruined village and seeing an old man sitting by a shattered stone wall. He tells his mother how the old man's hands looked exactly like his grandfather's hands, calloused, tired, holding onto a small, broken wooden bowl. He writes of the profound, crushing confusion he felt in that moment. Mother, he writes, the ink bleeding slightly into the coarse paper, we were told we are heroes bringing light. But when the people here look at me, they do not see a hero. They see a storm. They look at me with such deep, quiet terror, and I do not know how to carry it. I do not feel glorious. I only feel so very far from home. Yuri knows this letter would be confiscated. He knows it is a dangerous, forbidden thought. But the simple act of putting the ink on the paper releases a pressure in his chest that feels like it might otherwise break his ribs. A few tenths away, another candle burns low. This is Kaito, a boy who, just a few months ago, was sitting in a quiet university library reading ancient poetry. He is pale, his wire-rimmed glasses constantly sliding down the bridge of his nose. He is writing to his sweetheart, a girl named Hannah, who he promised to marry when the cherry blossoms bloomed again. Kaito's letter is a desperate attempt to hold on to beauty in a world that has suddenly become overwhelmingly ugly. He writes to her about the sky. He tells her that the stars here are the same stars that shine over the rivers of their home, and that he finds comfort in knowing they might both be looking up at the same moon. But the poetry cannot hold back the tide of his sorrow. He writes of the silence that follows the marching. He writes of finding a delicate, shattered porcelain teacup in the mud of an abandoned house, and how he sat and wept over it because it was so beautiful, and so broken, and so entirely innocent. My dearest Hannah, his pen scratches in the quiet dark. They told us we were marching toward a great destiny. But there is no destiny here. There is only an endless road of sorrow, and we are the ones paving it. I am surrounded by thousands of men, yet I have never felt so profoundly alone. I wear this uniform, but inside, I am just a boy who loves you. Please do not forget that boy. Please do not let the world tell you I was a monster. I just wanted to read my books. I just wanted to hold your hand. As Kaito writes, a sudden wave of homesickness hits him with the physical force of a blow. A single tear escapes his eye, falls through the cold air, and lands heavily on the paper. It lands right over the character for love, blurring the dark ink into a soft, spreading gray stain. He does not wipe it away. He simply lets it dry, a physical piece of his sorrow permanently woven into the fibers of the page. And then there is Haru. Haru is slightly older, a quiet man who worked as a carpenter before the draft notice arrived at his door. He is writing to someone he has never met. He is writing to his newborn child. His wife was heavy with their first baby when he boarded the train. He received a telegram a week ago, a single, joyful line of text delivered in a world of chaos, telling him he had a daughter. He sits in the darkest corner of the tent, using the side of a tin cup to shield his flickering candle. His letter is a map of dreams he fears he will never walk. He writes to his little girl, telling her about the shape of the cedar trees in their courtyard. He tells her how he carved a small wooden bird for her cradle, and how he hopes it makes her smile. He writes with a slow, deliberate care, wanting his handwriting to be perfect, wanting this piece of paper to be a beautiful thing for her to hold when she is older. My precious little one, Haru writes, his hand trembling gently. The world is very loud right now, and very angry. But you must know that you were born from peace, and you were born from love. I am in a far-off place, doing things I do not understand, so that perhaps, one day, you will never have to know what a rifle looks like. I pray to the ancestors that my hands, which are so dirty now, will be clean enough to hold you when I return. He folds the letter. He does not put it in an envelope. There is no address to write on the front. Instead, Yori, Kaido, and Haru, and thousands of boys just like them, do the exact same thing when their candles finally burn out. They fold their rough, ink-stained papers into tiny, tight squares. They unbutton the heavy woolen tunics of their uniforms, and they tuck the letters deep into the inside pockets of their undershirts. They place the words directly over their hearts. This is where the true history of the war was kept. It was not in the archives of the generals or the headlines of the newspapers. It was kept warm against the skin of terrified youths. These unsent letters became talismans, shields of paper constructed to protect their humanity from the brutalizing machinery of the empire. When they marched the next morning, when they raised their weapons, when they walked through the ruined villages, they felt the soft crinkle of the paper against their chests. It was a constant, secret reminder of who they really were. Many of these boys would never see their homes again. They would fall in the foreign mud, and their uniforms would be lost to the earth. And with them, the letters would dissolve. The tears, the ink, the quiet professions of love, the profound apologies to the people they were sent to conquer, all of it would melt quietly back into the ground, a silent, undocumented tragedy. But in the quiet hours of the night, while the ink was still wet, those letters were the most powerful things in the world. They were acts of profound, invisible rebellion. In a system designed to strip them of their individuality and turn them into unthinking instruments of expansion, the simple act of writing a tear-stained letter was a desperate, beautiful assertion of their own humanity. The wind continues to howl outside the canvas tents. The boys lie down on the hard, cold earth, pulling their thin blankets up to their chins. They close their tired eyes, the heavy sleep of the exhausted finally washing over them. And beneath the heavy wool, beneath the brass buttons and the weight of an empire's ambition, thousands of hidden paper squares rise and fall with the quiet, rhythmic breathing of boys who are just dreaming of a way to go home. Even the grandest city in the world can be reduced to the space illuminated by a single, trembling flame. If you were to walk along the magnificent, sweeping curve of the Bund in the late summer, just before the world tilted into darkness, you would have seen a city that believed it was invincible. Shanghai was a dizzying, intoxicating dream of modernity. It was a place of soaring stone facades, of jazz music spilling out from the brightly lit ballrooms of grand hotels, of neon lights reflecting in the dark, restless waters of the Huangpu River. It was a city of endless motion, a crossroads of the world where merchants, artists, and dreamers walked shoulder to shoulder under a canopy of electric stars. But dreams, no matter how grand, are fragile things. When the storm finally broke, it did not begin with the slow, creeping dread of the countryside. It arrived in the city with a sudden, deafening roar, tearing the beautiful illusion of safety to shreds in a matter of hours. The sky above the river, usually crowded with the white sails of merchant ships and the graceful flight of gulls, grew heavy with the dark, jagged silhouettes of foreign iron. As the autumn approached, a thick, gray fog began to roll off the water. It was a dense, clinging mist that swallowed the tops of the Art Deco towers and muted the vibrant colors of the streets. It felt as though the city itself was trying to pull a blanket over its head, hiding from the terrifying thunder that now echoed through its avenues day and night. But we will not look at the grand, ruined streets. We will not look at the maps, or the movements of the great gray ships, or the sweeping, destructive ambition of an empire that believed it had the right to swallow a continent. To truly understand the heart of this tragedy, we must step away from the roaring sky and descend into the absolute, quiet dark. Beneath a modest brick apartment building, tucked away in a narrow alley just a few streets over from the grand riverfront, there is a root cellar. The air down here is heavy and still. It smells of damp earth, of old wood, and of the sweet, dusty scent of stored potatoes and winter cabbage. It is a space built for preservation, a quiet pocket in the earth designed to keep things safe from the changing seasons above. Now, it is holding something far more precious than the autumn harvest. In the center of this small, earthen room, a single match is struck. The sudden hiss of sulfur is startlingly loud in the silence. A tiny teardrop of fire blooms in the dark, and a trembling hand touches it to the wick of a thick, white wax candle. As the golden light slowly expands, it pushes back the shadows just enough to reveal a family huddled together on a woven woolen blanket. There is the father, Wei. He is a clerk in a shipping office, a man whose life was entirely defined by ledgers, neat columns of numbers, and the predictable rhythm of the morning tram. His crisp white collar is now soiled with soot, his hair disheveled. He sits with his arms wrapped tightly around his knees, his eyes wide and fixed on the wooden floorboards above their heads. Beside him is his wife, Suing. She wears a beautiful, embroidered silk dress, the color of bruised plums, a garment she had put on days ago for a dinner party that never happened. Her hands are elegantly shaped, meant for playing the piano or pouring delicate cups of tea, but now they are covered in the gray dust of the cellar walls. Tucked safely between them, wrapped in a thick quilt, is their 7-year-old daughter, Jing. Her dark hair is woven into 2 neat braids. She is clutching a small, stuffed cloth rabbit to her chest, her wide, dark eyes reflecting the hypnotic dance of the candle flame. And resting against the far brick wall is grandmother, an old woman wrapped in a padded cotton jacket. Her eyes are closed, her breathing slow and even, an anchor of ancient calm in a sea of modern terror. Above them, the city is tearing itself apart. The floorboards occasionally tremble, vibrating with the deep, concussive thuds of heavy artillery falling somewhere in the distant districts. Every time the earth shakes, Wei flinches, a subtle tightening of his jaw, a white-knuckled grip on his own arms. He is a protector who has suddenly realized he has no power to protect his family from the sky. The invasion, to Wei, is not a geopolitical strategy. It is not a debate over territory or resources or national pride. It is simply the terrifying realization that the world he built, the quiet, respectable life he worked so hard to secure, is made of paper. The men in the distant island empire who ordered the ships to sail across the sea did not know Wei. They did not hate him. They simply did not see him. He, and millions like him, were merely obstacles in the path of a grand, terrifying machine of progress and domination. The heavy, muffled thud rolls through the earth again. This one is closer. A thin stream of dust falls from the wooden planks of the ceiling, drifting down through the candlelight like tiny, glowing snowflakes. Jing whimpers, burying her face into the soft wool of her mother's dress. The fear in the small room is a physical weight, pressing against their chests, making it difficult to breathe. But this is where the quiet miracle of humanity reveals itself. In the face of overwhelming, mechanical destruction, the human heart does not simply surrender to the dark. It finds a way to create its own light. Suing feels her daughter tremble. She takes a deep, slow breath, steadying her own racing heart. She gracefully reaches out and moves the candle just a few inches to the left, placing it closer to the smooth brick wall. Then, she raises her elegant, dust-covered hands, positioning them between the flame and the wall. She interlocks her thumbs, spreading her fingers wide. On the rough brick, a perfect, dark shadow appears. It is a bird. Suine gently flutters her fingers, and the shadow bird begins to fly across the wall. "Look, little one," Suine whispers, her voice as soft and melodic as a gentle rain. "Look at the swallow. She is flying all the way from the southern provinces. Do you see her?" Jing turns her head, peeking out from the folds of the silk dress. Her tear-filled eyes lock onto the shadow. The magic of the simple illusion captures her imagination, pulling her away from the terrifying noises above. "Where is she going, Mama?" Jing whispers back, her voice barely a breath. "She is going to a beautiful, quiet garden," Suine murmurs, her fingers continuing their graceful dance. "A garden where the bamboo grows tall and green, and the water in the pond is as clear as glass. She is going to a place where it is always spring." Wei watches his wife. He watches the soft, golden light illuminating the curve of her cheek, the fierce, beautiful determination in her eyes as she weaves a fairy tale to protect their child's mind from the war. A profound, overwhelming wave of love washes over him. It is a love so deep it brings fresh tears to his tired eyes. He reaches out and gently places his hand over Suine's shoulder, a silent gesture of gratitude, a promise that they are entirely together in the dark. From the corner of the cellar, the grandmother opens her eyes. She watches the shadow bird for a moment, a small, knowing smile touching the corners of her lips. She has lived through the fall of dynasties. She has seen the banners change, the armies march in and march out. She knows that empires rise and fall, breaking themselves against the patient anvil of time. She reaches deep into the pocket of her padded jacket and pulls out a tiny, folded square of waxed paper. Her hand shakes slightly as she unwraps it, revealing a single, small piece of crystallized ginger candy. She leans forward and holds it out to her granddaughter. Jing sits up, her eyes widening at the unexpected treasure. She takes the candy, her small fingers brushing against her grandmother's withered skin. "Eat it slowly, little lotus," the grandmother whispers, her voice raspy but full of warmth. "Let the sweetness last." Jing places the candy in her mouth. The sharp, sweet warmth of the ginger blooms on her tongue, entirely erasing the taste of fear and dust. She leans back against her father's chest, her eyes growing heavy, lulled by the rhythm of her mother's shadow bird and the safe, familiar heartbeat thumping steadily beneath Wei's soiled shirt. For hours, they sit in the cellar as the fog continues to roll over the ruined streets of the Bund above. The invasion is a monstrous, chaotic thing, a storm of ideology and iron designed to crush the spirit of a nation. But it cannot reach into this small, earthen room. It cannot touch the shadow swallow flying across the brick. It cannot steal the sweetness of the ginger on a child's tongue. The empire across the sea believed that by destroying the buildings, by claiming the ports, they would claim the soul of the people. They did not understand that the true strength of this city, the true resilience of this vast, ancient land, was not held in the stone banks or the neon lights. It was held right here, in the quiet, desperate embrace of a family sitting in the dirt. It was held in the small, everyday acts of heroism, a father trying to be brave, a mother inventing magic in the dark, a grandmother sharing her last piece of sweetness. Eventually, the candle burns down to a small, sputtering puddle of wax. The flame dances wildly for a moment, casting long, leaping shadows across the cellar, before finally yielding to the dark. The sudden blackness is absolute. But it is no longer terrifying. In the quiet dark, Wei pulls the heavy woolen blanket tightly around his family. He wraps his arms around Suine and Jing, burying his face in his wife's hair. They are a single, breathing entity, anchored to the earth by their love for one another. Above them, the fog is thick and heavy, wrapping the shattered city in a cold, gray shroud. The war will rage on, sweeping across the continent like a terrible, consuming fire, demanding a toll of sorrow that the world will never truly be able to measure. But beneath the earth, beneath the reach of the iron and the anger, the family sleeps. They hold on to each other, resting in the profound, quiet rebellion of simply remaining human, waiting with infinite patience for the long, terrible night to finally pass, and for the morning light to return. To walk away from one's home is to carry the weight of the sky on your shoulders. If you were to stand by the edge of a winding, unpaved road in the deep interior of China during the late autumn, you would hear a sound that belongs to no single instrument. It is not the crash of thunder, nor the sharp, frightening crack of a rifle. It is a soft, wet, relentless rhythm. It is the sound of a million footsteps sinking into the deep, cold mud. The autumn rains had come, washing away the last, lingering warmth of the summer and turning the ancient dirt paths into rivers of thick, gray clay. This was the Great Retreat. The modern cities on the coast, with their neon lights and bustling ports, had fallen into shadow. The empire across the sea had brought its iron and its fire, believing that by capturing the stone buildings and the paved avenues, they would capture the soul of the nation. They believed in a swift, decisive end. They believed the people would simply bow their heads and surrender to the inevitable momentum of a superior machine. But they did not understand the sheer, unfathomable vastness of the land, and they did not understand the quiet, enduring stubbornness of the people who belonged to it. Instead of surrendering, the people walked. They gathered whatever they could carry in their arms, strapped bundles to their backs, and turned their faces toward the setting sun. They walked away from the coast, away from the rivers they knew, heading deep into the rugged, mountainous heart of the continent. They were trading space for time, drawing the invader deeper and deeper into a landscape that could not be easily conquered by trains or tanks. But to the people on the road, this was not a grand military strategy. It was not a maneuver printed on a map in a general's tent. It was simply the agonizing, exhausting reality of survival. Imagine an older man named Professor Lin. He walks near the edge of the road, where the mud is slightly firmer, though his thin, cloth shoes have long since soaked through with freezing water. He is a man who spent his entire life in the quiet, dusty archives of a university, surrounded by the smell of old paper and the gentle scratch of fountain pens. He is fragile, his shoulders stooped beneath a heavy, awkward bamboo frame strapped to his back. He did not pack warm winter coats. He did not pack silver coins or precious jade. Wrapped in layers of weld cloth inside his bamboo frame are books. They are ancient texts, hand-stitched volumes of poetry and history that survived dynasties and droughts. When the sirens began to wail over his city, he knew that a nation is not defeated when its buildings fall, it is only defeated when it forgets who it is. And so, he became a beast of burden for the memory of his people. Every step is an agony. The straps cut deep into his shoulders. His breath puffs in small, white clouds in the damp autumn air. Next to him walks a family of farmers, their faces dark and weathered, pulling a small wooden cart with a broken wheel. In the city, the professor and the farmer would have existed in entirely different worlds. But the road has leveled them. The mud does not care about titles or education. It pulls at everyone's feet with the exact same, indifferent gravity. The farmer's wife, seeing the old scholar struggling, reaches into her deep pocket. She pulls out a small, wrinkled piece of dried sweet potato. She does not say a word. She simply holds it out to him. Professor Lin stops. He looks at her calloused hand, and then up at her tired, kind eyes. He takes the small piece of food, offering a deep, slow nod of his head. It is a tiny, seemingly insignificant exchange, but in the vast, cold emptiness of the retreat, it is a spark of profound warmth. It is the quiet recognition that they are all bound together in this suffering, and that they will only survive if they hold on to their shared humanity. Further down the road, the mist clings to the valleys, turning the silhouettes of the pine trees into soft, ghostly shapes. Walking through this mist is a young woman named Hua. She is carrying her entire world against her chest. Her husband is gone, swept up in the defense of a city she can no longer see. Hua is carrying her baby daughter, wrapped tightly in a woolen shawl. Her arms ache with a fierce, burning pain, and the muscles in her back feel as though they are made of brittle glass. The child is crying, a thin, exhausted sound that breaks Hua's heart with every note. The damp chill has seeped into their bones. Hua's feet drag in the thick clay. She feels that she cannot take another step. The sheer scale of the tragedy around her is too heavy. The line of refugees stretches out before her and behind her as far as the eye can see, a slow-moving river of sorrow. She wants to sit down in the mud and simply close her eyes. She wants to give up. But as the afternoon light begins to fade into a bruised, purple twilight, the road bends near an old, dilapidated way station. It is a small pavilion with a curved, tiled roof, mostly open to the wind. Huddled inside the pavilion are a dozen other travelers. In the center, a local villager, an old man with a face like a map of the mountains, has built a small, smoky fire out of damp twigs. He has placed a battered iron kettle over the flames. He does not have rice to offer. He does not have bread or blankets. But he has water, and he has fire. Hua steps into the shelter of the pavilion, her body shaking uncontrollably from the cold. The old man looks up. He sees the young mother, sees the tears streaming down her dirty cheeks, and sees the tiny face of the baby hidden in the shawl. He slowly pours a cup of hot water into a chipped porcelain bowl. He walks over to Hua and places the warm bowl in her freezing hands. The heat radiates through the ceramic, traveling up Hua's fingers, into her palms, and slowly seeping into her chest. She holds the bowl near the baby's face, letting the gentle, warm steam wash over her daughter's chilled cheeks. The baby's crying softens into a quiet hiccup, and then, finally, silence. Hua takes a slow sip of the plain, hot water. In that moment, it tastes sweeter than the finest tea she has ever known. It tastes like salvation. She looks around the small pavilion. The other refugees are huddled close together, sharing the meager warmth of the fire. A stranger sitting next to her, a young boy with no shoes, gently drapes a piece of dry burlap over Hua's shivering shoulders. This is the quiet miracle of the Great Retreat. The invading army believed that by inflicting terror, they would shatter the society. They believed the people would turn on each other in their desperation. But the opposite is happening. In the crucible of the autumn mud, the artificial walls of class and wealth are dissolving. What remains is a profound, instinctual solidarity. A shared cup of hot water. A dry piece of burlap. A piece of dried root vegetable offered without asking for anything in return. These are the tiny, invisible threads that are weaving a broken nation back together, right under the noses of the conquerors. The empire seeking to subjugate them was driven by a desperate, frantic need for resources. Their island was small, their ambitions were impossibly large. They needed the coal, the iron, the grain of the continent to feed their own starving war machine. They invaded because they felt the crushing weight of their own economic anxieties, lashing out to secure a lifeline. But in doing so, they completely miscalculated the nature of the land they were entering. They did not realize that a nation is not a fixed point on a map. A nation is its people. And the people were moving. As the night falls, the vast river of refugees finally comes to a halt. The road is simply too dark, and the mud is too treacherous to continue. All along the valleys and the hillsides, thousands of tiny, flickering orange lights begin to bloom. They are the campfires. From a distance, it looks as though the stars have fallen from the sky and settled into the creases of the earth. Professor Lin sits by one of these fires, carefully drying his soaked shoes near the flames. He rests his hand on his bamboo frame, feeling the solid, comforting shape of the books inside. He watches the sparks rise into the black sky and vanish. He is exhausted, but he feels a strange, deep sense of peace. He is carrying the past, but sitting around him, sharing the warmth of the fire, is the future. Hua sits a few fires away, cradling her sleeping daughter. The baby's breathing is steady and deep. Hua looks up at the towering, dark silhouettes of the mountains that lie ahead. They look intimidating, but they also look like a fortress. They look like a place where the heavy machinery of the invaders cannot easily follow. She closes her eyes and whispers a quiet, silent letter to her husband, wherever he may be. She tells him that they are safe tonight. She tells him about the hot water, and the dry burlap, and the old man with the kind eyes. She tells him that they are still walking, and that they will not stop until they find a place where the sky is quiet again. The wind picks up, blowing a cold draft down the valley. It rustles the dry, brown leaves of the autumn trees and sweeps across the miles of mud, beginning to freeze the deep footprints left behind by a million weary travelers. Those footprints are a testament. They are a declaration written into the very earth itself. They say, "We were here, we suffered, but we did not break." The long night settles over the interior. The fires burn low, casting soft, protective shadows over the sleeping families. The great retreat continues its quiet, agonizing pause, gathering strength in the dark. The mud is cold, and the road ahead is unimaginably long. But as the people rest, drawing comfort from the simple presence of one another, they are entirely unaware that their slow, painful footsteps are already marching toward the slow, inevitable exhaustion of the empire that chased them into the dark. The silence of falling snow is the heaviest sound in the world when you are waiting for a footstep that does not come. If you were to walk through the narrow, winding streets of a Japanese village in the deep midwinter of those years, you would find a world entirely muffled by the cold. The heavy clay tiles of the sloping roofs are buried beneath thick, white drifts. The ancient pine trees at the edge of the town bow their branches in quiet submission to the weight of the season. It is a landscape of profound, breathtaking stillness. But behind the thin, translucent barriers of the paper screens, that stillness is not peaceful. It is the tense, held-breath silence of a million mothers, sitting in the dim light, waiting for boys who have vanished into a vast, unfathomable distance. Let us step quietly into one of these homes. The air inside is biting, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of winter. In the center of the main room, a woman named Noriko sits upon the woven tatami mat. She is wrapped in her thickest quilted jacket, her shoulders drawn inward against the chill. Before her sits a small ceramic brazier, holding just 2 or 3 glowing red embers of charcoal. It is barely enough heat to warm her fingertips, but she leans over it, a solitary guardian of the fading light. Noriko is not a woman who concerns herself with the grand, sweeping lines drawn on the maps of generals. She does not understand the complex economic arguments of the politicians in the capital, who speak through the static of the wooden radio, claiming that the nation must stretch its arms across the sea to survive. They speak of destiny. They speak of a glorious, rising sun illuminating the dark corners of the continent. They say the empire is suffocating, desperate for resources, for space to breathe, and that this grand expansion is a noble sacrifice for the future of all families. But to Noriko, the future feels very small, and the sacrifice feels entirely unnatural. Her world is not made of geopolitics or iron. Her world was made of the sound of her son, Kenji, laughing in the garden. It was made of the sight of his muddy shoes left carelessly in the entryway. It was made of the comforting, predictable rhythm of a life shared. Now, the entryway is spotlessly clean. The house is painfully neat. And the silence is a physical weight pressing against her chest. In her lap, resting on her knees, is a long strip of white cotton cloth. It is a senenbari, a 1,000-stitch belt. For weeks, Noriko has stood near the village shrine in the freezing wind, politely asking every woman who passed to sew a single knot into the fabric using thick red thread. It is an ancient, desperate kind of magic. The belief is that the combined warmth, prayers, and spiritual strength of 1,000 women will form an impenetrable shield around the boy who wears it around his waist. She runs her thumb over the raised, crimson bumps. Each stitch is a tiny monument to a stranger's empathy. The baker's wife sewed a stitch. The schoolteacher sewed a stitch. Even the old woman who can barely see, whose own hands shook like dry autumn leaves, managed to push the needle through the cloth. They did it because they all share the exact same, quiet terror. They are a sisterhood forged in the agonizing crucible of the waiting. Noriko plans to send the belt in a parcel next week, along with dried plums and a pair of thick wool socks she knitted by the light of the moon. She works the fabric between her hands, imagining Kenji wrapping it around himself, hoping that somehow, across the freezing ocean and the endless, hostile plains, he will feel the warmth of her touch. The paper screen door rattles gently. It is not the wind. Noriko looks up as the door slides open just a fraction. A face peers in, wrapped in a thick wool scarf. It is Mrs. Sato, her neighbor from across the alleyway. Mrs. Sato steps inside, quickly closing the door behind her to keep the bitter wind at bay. She brushes a dusting of snow from her shoulders. In her hands, she carries a small, wrapped bundle. She does not offer a loud greeting. There is no need for forced cheerfulness here. She simply kneels beside Noriko and unwraps the cloth to reveal 2 steaming, roasted sweet potatoes. The fire in my kitchen was still warm, Mrs. Sato whispers, her voice a soft, comforting murmur. I thought we could share. Noriko bows her head in profound gratitude. Food is becoming scarce. The rice is being sent away to feed the grand, moving army. The rationing has become strict, and every meal is a careful, anxious calculation. To offer a hot, sweet potato in the dead of winter is an act of deep, quiet heroism. It is a lifeline thrown across the dark. They sit together in the dim room, peeling back the charred, papery skin of the potatoes. The sweet, earthy steam rises between them, a fleeting comfort against the cold. They eat slowly, savoring the warmth as it travels down to their stomachs. For a long time, they do not speak. The only sounds are the whistling of the wind outside and the soft settling of the white ash in the brazier. The postman came down my street today, Mrs. Sato finally says, staring into the dying embers. Her voice does not tremble, but it is hollowed out by a long, exhausting fear. Noriko stops chewing. Her heart skips a single, painful beat. The postman is the harbinger of all things. The sight of his bicycle tires leaving tracks in the fresh snow is enough to make a mother feel faint. He brings the precious, scribbled postcards from the front. But he also brings the small, plain wooden boxes, wrapped in white cloth, containing nothing but a handful of ashes and a few strands of hair. He did not stop at my door, Mrs. Sato continues, a slow exhale of breath escaping her lips. He rode past. I watched him until he turned the corner. I do not know if I should feel relieved that there is no bad news, or terrified that there is no news at all. Noriko reaches out and places her hand gently over her friend's wrist. The skin is cold, but the connection is a profound anchor. No news is just the winter sleeping, Noriko whispers. We must believe they are simply too busy trying to stay warm to hold a pen. But Noriko knows the truth of the pen. Carefully, she reaches into the breast pocket of her own jacket and pulls out a piece of paper. It has been folded and unfolded so many times that it is as soft as silk, the creases threatening to tear. It is the last letter she received from Kenji, nearly 2 months ago. She does not need to read it. She has memorized the exact shape of every character, the slight smudge of ink in the bottom corner, the way his handwriting slants when he is tired. He had written to her from a place he called the Great Northern Plain. He did not write about glory. He did not write about the sacred mission of the empire. He wrote about the wind. He told her that the wind there was like a living, angry thing. It did not just blow, it howled, carrying a dust so fine it seeped through the heavy canvas of their tents and coated their teeth while they slept. He wrote that the snow was not like the soft, poetic snow of their home. It was hard, and sharp, and blindingly bright. Mother, he had written at the very end. I look at the moon here, and it seems so much smaller than the moon that shines over our roof. Please, do not worry for me. I am eating my rations. I am keeping my boots dry. Just keep the fire warm for when I return. Noriko holds the letter against her chest. She tries to imagine him. She tries to picture the vast, frozen landscape he described, but her mind cannot grasp it. The Empire has asked her to send her child into a void, into a narrative she cannot see or touch or understand. She is a woman who knows the exact number of steps it takes to reach the village well, who knows the precise day the plum blossoms will open in the spring. The terrifying, sprawling expanse of the continent is an abstraction that only brings her sorrow. She feels a deep, quiet resentment building in the shadows of her heart. It is a dangerous feeling, one she would never dare speak aloud. The leaders demand absolute loyalty. They demand joyful sacrifice. They tell the mothers to smile when they send their sons to the trains, to wave the small paper flags with unwavering pride. But how can a mother feel pride when she knows her child is shivering in the dark? How can she care about the geopolitical necessity of securing a railway line when all she wants is to know if her boy has a blanket? The tragic irony of the invasion is that it was launched, in part, under the guise of protecting the family, of securing a prosperous future for the children of the empire. But in the execution of that grand vision, it was systematically emptying the homes it claimed to protect. It was leaving the mothers to sit in the freezing dark, staring at empty doorways, their lives suspended in a slow, agonizing purgatory of waiting. Mrs. Sato finishes her sweet potato and carefully wipes her hands on a small cloth. She looks at Noriko, at the letter held tightly against the mother's chest, and she understands. There are no words that can fill the space left by a missing child. I must go back, Mrs. Sato whispers, rising slowly, her joints stiff from the cold. The snow is getting heavier. I will come again tomorrow. We will drink tea. Thank you, Noriko replies softly. Be careful on the ice. She watches her friend slide the paper screen open and step back out into the swirling white night. The door closes, and the silence rushes back in, heavier than before. Noriko is alone again. A sudden, sharp gust of wind hits the side of the house. The wooden frame groans, and a tiny, icy draft finds its way through a minute tear in the paper screen. It brushes across Noriko's cheek like a phantom touch. She does not move to fix it. She simply closes her eyes. In the absolute quiet of the frozen night, she bows her head over the 1,000-stitch belt in her lap. She imagines a golden thread, infinitely long, extending from her own beating heart, out through the paper screen, up into the falling snow, and across the dark, churning waters of the sea. She imagines it traveling over the strange, hostile plains, searching through the howling wind and the blinding ice, until it finally finds a boy in a heavy, too large uniform, curled up in the dark. She prays with a fierce, quiet intensity that is more powerful than any marching song. She does not pray for victory. She does not pray for the conquest of foreign capitals or the expansion of the imperial borders. She simply prays for the dawn. She prays for the sun to rise and warm the foreign earth. She prays that the snow will melt. She prays that the boys on both sides of the terrible, invisible lines will simply drop their heavy iron rifles and turn their faces toward home. The small charcoal embers in the brazier finally give out, blinking their orange light one last time before fading into gray ash. The room is plunged into the blue, shadowy glow of the winter moon. Noriko pulls her coat tighter, folds the precious letter back into her pocket, and resumes her vigil. The cold wind continues to whisper through the paper screen, a ceaseless, mournful lullaby for a nation of mothers, waiting in the dark, holding the shattered pieces of their hearts together with nothing but 1,000 tiny stitches of red thread, and an endless, quiet, agonizing hope. A song cannot rebuild a shattered wall, but it can build a quiet room in the mind where the heart can safely rest. If you were to walk through the sprawling, makeshift city of canvas and mud that had bloomed across the western valleys, you would find a silence born not of peace, but of profound, collective exhaustion. It is the twilight of a cold, damp day in the interior. The sky above the refugee camp is a bruised, heavy violet, pressing down upon thousands of fragile tents made of stretched oilcloth, torn blankets, and scavenged bamboo. The people here have walked for weeks. They have left behind the vibrant, bustling streets of the coastal cities, the quiet, ancient courtyards of their ancestral villages, and the fertile, emerald fields they had tended since childhood. They have been chased by a storm of iron and ideology, pushed relentlessly westward by an invading force that hungered for the earth beneath their feet. But in the fading light of this camp, there are no grand geopolitical struggles. There is only the biting chill of the evening air, the desperate search for dry firewood, and the heavy, unspoken grief of a million displaced souls. Near the edge of the camp, where the mud gives way to a small grove of shivering willow trees, an old man sits on an overturned wooden crate. His name is Master Chen. Before the world broke apart, he had been a musician in a tea house in Nanjing. He used to sit on a raised wooden dais, surrounded by the sweet scent of jasmine pearls and the gentle clinking of porcelain cups, playing melodies that made the merchants and scholars forget their worldly troubles. When the warning sirens finally wailed over his city, Master Chen did not pack silver coins, or winter coats, or bags of precious rice. He took only the clothes on his back, and a slender, wooden case wrapped in a piece of oiled canvas. Inside that case was his eru. The eru is a humble instrument, consisting of a long wooden neck, a small sound box covered in python skin, and 2 strings. It is played with a bamboo bow strung with horsehair. It does not possess the sweeping, orchestral power of a piano, nor the bright, piercing clarity of a trumpet. Instead, the eru sounds remarkably like a human voice. It sighs, it trembles, and it weeps. Master Chen gently unwraps the canvas. His hands are thin, his knuckles swollen from the dampness of the long journey. He looks down at his instrument. During the chaotic scramble to cross a crowded pontoon bridge weeks ago, he had been pushed against a stone railing. The delicate instrument had taken the brunt of the impact. The wooden neck is bruised, and one of the 2 silk strings has snapped entirely, leaving a curled, frayed end resting uselessly against the sound box. An eru with a broken string is a crippled thing. It is missing half of its voice, half of its range, half of its soul. But Master Chen does not put the instrument away. He rests the small sound box on his left thigh. He takes the bamboo bow in his right hand. He closes his eyes, taking a slow, deep breath of the wood smoke-scented air. He does not try to fix the broken string. He simply accepts the damage, adjusting his fingers to coax whatever beauty remains from the single, surviving thread of silk. He draws the bow across the string. A single, sustained note rises into the damp evening air. It is a fragile, trembling sound, vibrating with a profound and exquisite melancholy. It wavers for a moment, like a candle flame caught in a draught, before finding its center and soaring upward. The sound cuts through the low murmur of the camp. It cuts through the quiet weeping of a child in a nearby tent. It cuts through the dull, rhythmic chopping of a blunt axe against a wet log. Slowly, the people closest to the willow grove stop what they are doing. A woman named May, who is kneeling in the mud trying to scrub the dirt from a single, torn cotton shirt, freezes. Her hands, red and raw from the cold water, rest against the edge of her wooden basin. She turns her head toward the music. The melody Master Chen is playing is an old, simple folk song from the southern provinces. It is a song about a fisherman returning home at dusk, watching the lanterns light up along the riverbank. As the single, weeping note of the arrow washes over her, May closes her eyes. The mud, the cold, the terrifying roar of the airplanes that still haunts her dreams, it all slowly dissolves. In her mind, she is suddenly standing on the stone bridge of her hometown. She can smell the sweet osmanthus flowers blooming in her neighbor's courtyard. She can feel the smooth, warm wood of the doorframe she will never touch again. A single tear escapes her closed eyelid, tracing a clean path down her soot-stained cheek. It is not a tear of pure sorrow, but a tear of desperate, agonizing relief. The music has given her a safe place to finally set down the heavy burden of her bravery. A few feet away, an older man named Liang sits close to a dying fire, wrapped in a blanket that is far too thin. Liang was once a proud scholar, a man who possessed a library of thousands of books. All of them are ashes now, burned in a courtyard to prevent them from falling into the hands of an empire that wished to rewrite his nation's history. Liang listens to the broken eru. He hears the missing notes, the spaces where the harmony should be. He hears the profound struggle of the musician trying to make a complete song out of shattered pieces. To Liang, the lone, struggling string is the most beautiful thing he has ever heard. It is the sound of his people. They are battered, they are broken, they have been stripped of everything that made them whole. The invading army believed that by destroying their cities and scattering their families, they would break the spirit of the nation. They believed a people without a home would simply surrender to the dark. But Liang watches Master Chen's withered hand moving the bow with infinite, tender grace. He realizes that the empire across the sea has made a terrible miscalculation. They can burn the libraries, they can occupy the capitals, they can turn the roads to mud. But they cannot conquer the space between the notes. They cannot steal the memory of the osmanthus flowers from a woman by the washing basin. They cannot silence the quiet, stubborn resilience of a culture that knows how to sing even when half of its strings are broken. The melody drifts further into the camp, carried by the gentle evening wind. It reaches a young boy named Jean, sitting alone on a pile of bundled straw. Jean is an orphan of the retreat. He lost his parents in the panic of a crowded train station and has been walking with strangers ever since. His face is a mask of hardened, blank survival. He has forgotten how to be a child. But as the sweet, sorrowful voice of the era wraps around him, something in his small, rigid chest begins to loosen. He remembers his father humming this exact tune while mending a fishing net in the afternoon sun. He remembers his mother tapping her foot to the rhythm on the wooden floorboards. Jean pulls his knees to his chest and rests his chin on his crossed arms. For the first time in weeks, he does not feel the paralyzing grip of terror. He just feels lonely. He allows himself to be a little boy who misses his mother. The music holds him, rocking him gently in a cradle of pure, unadulterated memory. Master Chen plays on. His eyes remain closed, his face entirely serene. He is no longer in a refugee camp. He is floating on the river of the melody. He feels the agonizing limitation of the single string, the physical effort required to bend and slide his fingers to reach the notes that should belong to the broken half of his instrument. But he does not stop. He weaves a tapestry of sound that is imperfect, ragged, and breathtakingly human. It is a lullaby for a displaced nation. It is a profound act of everyday heroism. Master Chen cannot offer bread to the starving. He cannot offer blankets to the freezing. He cannot offer a map that shows a safe way out of the mountains. But he is offering the only wealth he has left. He is offering a fleeting moment of grace. He is reminding the shivering people in the mud that they are still capable of feeling beauty, that their souls are not yet entirely calloused over by the brutality of the world. The song begins to slow, the notes stretching out, growing softer and softer, like a boat slowly disappearing into the evening mist. Master Chen draws the bow across the string one final, delicate time. The last note hangs in the air, a whisper of sound that slowly fades into the natural silence of the twilight. He lowers the bow. He rests his hand on the bruised wooden neck of the instrument. For a long moment, nobody in the camp moves. There is no applause. Applause belongs in theaters and tea-houses, not in the sacred, devastated quiet of a refugee camp. Instead, there is a profound, shared stillness. It is the silence of 1,000 people holding a fragile, precious memory in their hands, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter it. Slowly, the spell recedes. The reality of the cold and the mud returns, but the air feels different. The crushing, suffocating weight of the evening has been slightly lifted. May wipes her eyes with the back of her damp hand, offering a quiet, unseen nod of gratitude toward the willow trees. She returns to her washing, but her movements are gentler now. Liang the scholar pulls his thin blanket a little tighter, staring into the embers with a renewed, quiet defiance in his eyes. Jean, the little boy, lies down on his straw, curling into a ball, and falls into the first deep, dreamless sleep he has had since the bombing began. Near the willow grove, a shadow steps into the dim light. It is an old farmer, a man whose back is permanently bent from a lifetime of labor in the fields. He carries a small, dented tin cup. A faint wisp of steam rises from the rim. He walks slowly up to Master Chen. He does not speak. He simply holds out the cup with two trembling, calloused hands. Master Chen opens his eyes. He looks at the farmer and then at the cup of hot water. It is a gesture of absolute, profound respect. It is an acknowledgement that the musician has nourished them just as surely as if he had handed them a bowl of rice. Master Chen takes the cup. He wraps his cold fingers around the warm tin. He offers a slow, deep bow of his head to the farmer. The night finally settles completely over the sprawling camp. The small fires burn down to glowing red eyes in the dark. The wind sighs through the branches of the willow trees. Master Chen carefully wraps his broken arrow back into the oiled canvas, securing it tightly against his chest. He sips the hot water, feeling the warmth travel down into his tired bones. The Empire across the sea will continue its march tomorrow. The thunder of their machines will return to shatter the sky. The people will have to pack their meager belongings and walk even further into the harsh, unforgiving mountains. The tragedy is far from over. But tonight, beneath the bruised, violet sky, the broken string of the arrow has stitched the torn people back together, just for a little while. They rest in the mud, protected by the invisible, enduring armor of their shared song, finding a quiet, stubborn peace in the dark that no army, no matter how grand, could ever hope to steal. The earth does not remember the names of the men who march across it, it only remembers the weight of the seed. If you were to walk out into the vast, sweeping valleys of the Chinese countryside after the armies had passed, you would find a landscape that seemed, at first glance, to be holding its breath. The heavy, dark smoke that had choked the horizon for weeks has finally thinned, carried away by a gentle, indifferent breeze. What remains is a world bruised by iron and fire. The tall, elegant stalks of sorghum have been trampled into the mud, snapped like fragile bones beneath the heavy treads of an empire's war machine. The ancient irrigation ditches, dug by hand centuries ago, are choked with ash and broken stone. It is a scene of profound and quiet devastation. It looks like the end of the world. But if you look very closely, just beneath the scarred surface of the fields, you will find that the earth is not dead. It is simply waiting. And moving slowly across this wounded canvas, looking incredibly small against the backdrop of the misty mountains, is a man who understands the patience of the soil. His name is Lao Gao. He is a farmer, a man whose life has been entirely dictated by the rising of the sun and the turning of the seasons. His face is deeply lined, weathered to the color of roasted chestnuts by decades of wind and sun. He walks with a slight stoop, his shoulders carrying the invisible, heavy mantle of a life spent bending toward the earth. Lao Gao wears a faded blue cotton jacket, heavily patched at the elbows and the knees. The fabric is worn so thin in places that it is nearly translucent, soft as an old memory. He steps carefully over the deep, jagged ruts left by the artillery wheels. He does not weep as he looks at his ruined livelihood. He has seen floods wash away his crops, he has seen droughts turn the soil to bitter dust. To Lao Gao, this war is simply another kind of terrible weather, a storm made of men instead of rain. He stops in the center of what used to be a vibrant, emerald expanse of winter wheat. He kneels down slowly, his joints popping quietly in the damp morning air. He rests his calloused hands on his thighs and takes a deep, ragged breath. The air still smells faintly of sulfur and burning wood, a sharp, unnatural scent that burns the back of the throat. But beneath it, if you breathe deeply enough, there is the rich, dark, eternal smell of the mud. Lao Gao reaches a hand deep into the pocket of his padded jacket. His fingers, rough as tree bark, close around a small, tightly tied cloth pouch. This pouch is the most valuable thing he owns. It does not contain silver, or jade, or paper money. It contains seeds. Before the distant thunder of the invasion had reached his valley, before the sky had turned gray with airplanes, Lao Gao had done what his father had done, and his grandfather before him. During the last harvest, before the world broke apart, he had meticulously selected the finest, strongest grains of wheat. He had dried them in the autumn sun and hidden them away in this small, embroidered pouch. He unties the thin cotton string with clumsy, freezing fingers. He opens the pouch and pours a handful of the seeds into his open palm. They are hard, pale, and entirely unremarkable to the naked eye. They look like tiny pebbles. But as Lao Gao looks at them, he sees a miracle. He sees the absolute, undeniable promise of tomorrow. He sees green shoots pushing through the dark. He sees the golden waves of the future harvest. He sees the survival of his family. The empire across the sea, the men sitting in their grand, wood-paneled rooms studying maps, did not understand this small pouch of seeds. When they looked across the ocean, they did not see Lao Gao. They saw abstract numbers. They saw arable land. They saw a vast, empty space that could be claimed, cultivated, and funneled back to their own starving islands to feed their growing war machine. They viewed the land as a resource to be conquered, a silent object to be dominated by the sheer force of modern will. But to the farmer kneeling in the mud, the land is not an object. It is a living, breathing relative. It is an ancestor. It is a partner in the delicate dance of survival. You cannot conquer the earth with a rifle, any more than you can shoot the winter to make it spring. Lao Gao brushes a layer of gray ash away from the surface of the soil. His fingers encounter something hard and cold. He digs slightly and pulls out a jagged, heavy piece of iron shrapnel. Its edges are sharp and cruel, a fragment of the violence that tore through his quiet world. He looks at the piece of iron in his left hand, and the handful of pale seeds in his right. It is the ultimate distillation of the era. The iron represents the destructive, frantic ambition of an empire trying to force its will upon the world. The seeds represent the quiet, enduring, stubborn resilience of life simply refusing to yield. Very gently, as if removing a thorn from a dog's paw, Lao Gao tosses the jagged iron into a pile of debris at the edge of the field. He turns his attention back to the soil. Beside him, a small figure kneels in the dirt. It is his young grandson, Wei. The boy's face is smudged with soot, and he is wearing shoes that are entirely too large for him, the toes stuffed with dry straw to keep his small feet warm. Wei watches his grandfather with wide, trusting eyes. He does not understand the politics of the invasion. He only knows that his stomach aches with a constant, dull hunger, and that his grandfather has told him today is the day they fight back. But they do not fight with anger. They fight with patience. Lao Gao takes a small wooden hand plow, its blade dulled by years of use, and begins to drag it through the earth, creating a shallow, straight furrow. The soil is heavy and damp, resisting his efforts, but he leans his weight into the wood, moving with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. "Come, little bird," Lao Gao whispers, his voice a soft, low rumble that blends perfectly with the rustling of the wind. Wei scoots forward on his knees. He reaches his small hand into his grandfather's palm, pinching 3 tiny seeds between his thumb and forefinger. Carefully, reverently, the little boy places the seeds into the dark furrow. Lao Gao moves his hand, gently sweeping the soft, damp earth over the seeds, tucking them in like children under a heavy winter quilt. He pats the dirt flat, sealing the promise into the ground. They move forward, inch by painful inch. Dig. Drop. Cover. Dig. Drop. Cover. It is an act of profound, invisible heroism. While the world above them is tearing itself apart with unimaginable noise and fury, while nations draw lines on maps in blood, this old man and his grandson are quietly, methodically stitching the torn fabric of the world back together. They are declaring, with every seed they drop into the dark, that the future will still happen. They are declaring that the spring will still arrive, and that the earth will still remember how to feed her children. A shadow falls across the furrow. Lao Gao looks up, shielding his eyes from the pale, watery sun. Standing on the narrow dirt path between the fields is their neighbor, Auntie Chen. Her own house was burned to the foundation just 3 days ago. She is carrying everything she owns in a woven bamboo basket on her back. Her face is a portrait of profound exhaustion, her eyes hollowed out by grief and fear. She is joining the long, tragic line of refugees heading west, away from the coast, away from the encroaching storm. She stops and watches Lao Gao and the little boy in the mud. Lao Gao stands up, his knees cracking loudly. He does not offer a platitude. He does not tell her everything will be all right, because they both know it will not be. He simply reaches into his deep pocket, pulls out a tiny handful of the precious wheat seeds, and walks slowly toward the edge of the field. He holds out his hand. Auntie Chen looks at the seeds, and then up at the old man's withered face. Her lower lip begins to tremble. She reaches out a dirty, shaking hand, and Lao Gao pours the seeds into her palm. For wherever you stop walking, Lao Gao whispers gently. The earth is the same everywhere. It only needs a quiet hand. Auntie Chen closes her fingers around the seeds, holding them tightly against her chest. She nods, a single, deep bow of profound gratitude, and turns back to the road, carrying a tiny, physical piece of her homeland into the unknown. Lao Gao returns to his grandson. The afternoon stretches on, the pale sun slowly descending toward the jagged peaks of the western mountains. The air grows colder, biting at their exposed cheeks and noses. The muscles in Lao Gao's back scream in protest, a fiery ache that radiates down his legs, but he does not stop. He cannot stop. If they do not plant today, there will be nothing to harvest when the snows melt. As the light begins to fade, turning the sky into a canvas of deep, bruised purples and soft pinks, they reach the end of the field. The cloth pouch is empty. Lao Gao sits heavily on the cold ground, pulling his grandson into his lap. He wraps his patched cotton jacket around the boy, sharing his meager body heat. They sit together in the gathering twilight, looking out over the patch of scarred earth they have just tended. It does not look any different than it did this morning. The scars are still there. The broken stalks are still scattered in the mud. There are no green shoots, no sudden miraculous harvest. But Lao Gao feels a deep, quiet peace settling over his tired heart. The seeds are hidden in the dark. They are safe beneath the ash and the iron. They are sleeping in the damp earth, drawing strength from the soil, preparing for the slow, miraculous work of pushing upward toward the light. He rests his chin on his grandson's dark hair, closing his eyes. He listens to the quiet symphony of the evening, the distant call of a solitary crow, the rustle of the dry reeds in the ditch, and the incredibly soft, almost imperceptible sound of the first drops of rain beginning to fall. The rain is gentle. It is not a storm. It is a soft, misting drizzle that kisses the dry dust and sinks deep into the newly turned furrows. It is the earth breathing a sigh of relief. The empire that sought to conquer them believed that power was measured in the weight of steel and the volume of gunpowder. They believed that by inflicting terror and destruction, they could force a people into submission. But they did not understand the quiet, unbreakable power of a seed. They did not understand that true resilience does not roar, it simply waits. It waits in the deep pockets of a faded coat. It waits in the calloused hands of an old man. It waits in the dark, damp earth, holding on to the ancient, undeniable promise that no matter how long the winter lasts, no matter how terrible the storm, life will always, eventually, find a way to reach for the sun. Lao Gao holds his grandson tight as the gentle rain continues to fall, washing the soot from their faces, washing the ash into the soil, slowly and patiently healing the broken world, one quiet drop at a time. A monster is not always born from a sudden, deafening roar. Sometimes it is built quietly, piece by piece, from endless, rustling stacks of paper. If you were to walk away from the muddy, freezing plains of the continent and travel back across the dark waters of the sea to the glittering, modern heart of the empire, you would not immediately see the face of the war. In the quiet, affluent neighborhoods of the capital, the streets were swept clean. The street lamps cast a warm, electric glow over polished wooden gates, and the evening air smelled faintly of roasted sweet potatoes and damp pine needles. It looked, to the casual observer, like a world completely at peace. But true storms do not only ravage the forests, they also change the pressure of the air inside the most heavily fortified rooms. To understand the sheer, tragic momentum of the invasion, we must look beyond the men who carried the rifles and step into the silent, shadow-filled studies of the men who carried the pens. Imagine a man named Tatsuo. He is a mid-level official in a sprawling, concrete government ministry. He is a man who has always found a profound, soothing comfort in order. He loves the quiet scratch of a good fountain pen. He loves the neat, parallel lines of a ledger. In his youth, he had studied literature, spending his afternoons reading ancient, delicate poems about the changing of the seasons and the fleeting beauty of the autumn moon. He had believed, as many young men do, that he was going to help build a modern, enlightened, and beautiful nation. Now, his hair is turning a soft, distinguished silver at the temples, but the lines around his eyes are not born of wisdom. They are carved by a deep, chronic, and entirely secret exhaustion. It is long past midnight. The city is asleep, wrapped in the cold embrace of the winter night. Tatsuo sits alone in his private study. The room is a sanctuary of traditional wood and woven tatami mats. The only light comes from a small, paper-shaded lamp on his low writing desk. Beside him, a small charcoal brazier offers a faint, glowing warmth. Before him are the closed, sliding shoji doors that separate his study from the garden. The delicate, translucent paper of the doors glows warmly from the light of the lamp, catching the intricate, shifting shadows of the pine branches outside, swaying gently in the unseen wind. On his desk sits a stack of heavy, manila folders. Tatsuo's job is a quiet one. He does not shout orders from a balcony. He does not plan the movement of troops. He is simply a cog in the vast, churning machinery of logistics. His days are spent reviewing requisitions. He calculates the tonnage of coal required to move a fleet of ships. He tallies the yards of heavy wool needed for winter coats. He approves the schedules for the freight trains that roll endlessly toward the northern ports. It is sterile, bureaucratic work. It is designed to be devoid of emotion. The language of the documents is deliberately cold, transforming the staggering, terrifying realities of a continent-spanning conflict into neat rows of black ink. But Tatsuo has an imagination, and that is his quiet curse. He reaches out and opens the top folder. He stares down at the columns of numbers. Today, the numbers represent grain. It is an order detailing the seizure of the autumn harvest from a vast, fertile province across the sea, a province currently occupied by their advancing forces. The numbers are staggering. Tatsuo touches his fingertips to the paper. He closes his eyes, and the sterile numbers vanish. In his mind, he sees the faces of the farmers he is casually starving with the stroke of his pen. Decades ago, long before the borders grew rigid and angry, Tatsuo had traveled to that very province as a young student. He remembers the rich, dark smell of the soil. He remembers sitting in a bustling, noisy tea house, drinking sweet jasmine tea with a Chinese merchant who had laughed loudly and shared a plate of steamed dumplings with him. They had communicated by tracing shared characters on the wooden table with water, finding a beautiful, silent bridge between their two cultures. Where is that merchant now? Tatsuo wonders, his heart aching with a sudden, sharp sorrow. Is he standing in a ruined field? Is he hiding his children from the very soldiers whose boots Tatsuo has just authorized the funding for? Tatsuo opens his eyes and looks at the small, round object resting on the corner of his desk. It is his hanko, his personal wooden seal. Beside it sits a shallow ceramic dish filled with thick, vermilion ink paste. For years, pressing that stamp onto a document was a point of pride. It was a symbol of his responsibility, his small but meaningful place in the grand architecture of his nation. But lately, when he looks at the red paste, he feels a cold shiver trace the line of his spine. It no longer looks like ink. It looks like a terrible, permanent stain. Why doesn't he stop? It is the question that haunts his every waking moment, the whisper that keeps him staring at the shadows on the shoji doors until the dawn breaks. Why doesn't he simply refuse to lift the stamp? Why doesn't he throw the ledgers into the fire? He does not stop because he is trapped. He is trapped by a momentum that has grown far larger and far more terrifying than any single man. The atmosphere in the capital has changed. The air has grown thin and suspicious. The military police, men with hard eyes and absolute authority, patrol the streets and listen in the tea houses. Neighbors watch neighbors. A single word of dissent, a momentary hesitation to celebrate the latest glorious victory, is enough to invite a knock on the door in the middle of the night. To speak out is not merely to lose his quiet, respectable job. It is to invite ruin upon his entire house. He thinks of his wife, sleeping peacefully in the next room. He thinks of his 2 teenage daughters, who wear their school uniforms with such innocent pride, unaware of the dark currents swirling beneath their feet. If Tatsuo were to stand up and shout that the emperor has no clothes, that the grand mission across the sea is nothing but a tragic, violent theft, he would be crushed instantly. He would become a traitor, and his daughters would carry the heavy, inescapable shadow of his shame for the rest of their lives. And so, he is a prisoner of his own love for them. He trades his own soul, ounce by ounce, stamp by stamp, to buy their continued safety. It is a uniquely quiet, agonizing kind of tragedy. It is the tragedy of a good, gentle man who finds himself swept up in a current of history that is moving entirely in the wrong direction, paddling furiously not to change the course of the river, but simply to keep his family's small boat from capsizing. Tatsuo picks up the wooden stamp. It feels heavy in his hand, as heavy as a stone pulled from the bottom of a deep river. He presses it down into the red paste. Just then, the shoji door behind him slides open, making a soft, whispering sound against the wooden track. Tatsuo turns. Standing in the doorway is his wife, Shizuko. She is wrapped in a thick, woolen robe, her dark hair falling loosely over her shoulders. She does not look angry, nor does she look surprised to find him awake at such a hollow hour. She carries a small, lacquered tray holding a single, steaming cup of roasted barley tea. She walks quietly across the tatami mat and kneels beside his low desk. She places the tea near his hand, careful not to disturb the towering stacks of paper. Shizuko looks at the dark circles beneath her husband's eyes. She looks at the way his hand is gripping the wooden stamp, so tightly that his knuckles have turned completely white. She is a woman of profound intuition. She does not know the exact details of the grain requisitions or the troop movements. But she knows the man she married. She knows the gentle poet who once wrote her letters on beautiful, handmade paper. And she can see the terrible, crushing weight that is slowly pressing the life out of him. "The wind is very cold tonight," she whispers, her voice as soft as the rustling pine needles outside. Tatsuo slowly releases his grip on the stamp. He looks at his wife, his vision suddenly blurring with a hot, unshed tear. He desperately wants to confess. He wants to fall apart. He wants to tell her about the merchant in the tea house, about the starving farmers, about the terrible, suffocating feeling of being a ghost haunting his own life. But he cannot give her that burden. To speak it aloud is to make it real, and to make it real is to put her in danger. Instead, he reaches out and covers her small, warm hand with his own. His fingers are trembling. Yes, he says, his voice thick with a sorrow he cannot name. It is very cold. Shizuko does not press him. She does not demand the words he cannot give. She simply turns her hand over and interlaces her fingers with his. She squeezes gently. In that single, silent gesture, an entire universe of understanding passes between them. She is telling him that she sees his pain. She is telling him that she knows he is walking through a dark valley, and that even if he cannot tell her what monsters hide in the shadows, she will not let him walk it entirely alone. It is a tiny, fragile moment of grace in a world that is rapidly losing its mind. It is the quiet, everyday heroism of a marriage, holding back the dark with nothing but a cup of warm tea and the touch of a hand. They sit together for a long time, watching the shadows dance across the paper screen. The shadows look like reaching fingers, like ghosts trying to find their way back into the warmth of the room. The Empire is demanding everything from its people, their sons, their harvests, their absolute loyalty, and ultimately, their conscience. Tatsuo finally lets go of his wife's hand. He takes a slow sip of the barley tea. The warmth travels down his throat, a temporary comfort against the chill of the room. He looks back at the folder on his desk. The numbers are still there. The machine is still hungry. It does not care about his poetry, or his memories, or the heavy, aching sorrow in his chest. It only demands the ink. With a slow, resigned breath, Tatsuo lifts his hand. He moves the wooden seal over the bottom corner of the requisition order. He presses it down onto the page. The red mark is sharp, bright, and perfectly legible. It is done. Another train will roll into the dark. Another village will go hungry. Another piece of the world will break, and Tatsuo has legally, formally, and silently given his permission for it to happen. He sets the stamp down and closes the folder. He feels hollowed out, an empty shell sitting in a quiet room. The great tragedies of history are not only committed by monsters with cruel eyes. They are also committed by tired, frightened men in quiet rooms, men who simply want to protect their families, men who look at the towering, terrifying momentum of the world and quietly, tragically, decide that they have no choice but to let the shadows fall. The coldest nights do not ask what flag you carry, they only ask if you have a fire. If you were to walk through the deepest valleys of the interior during the darkest, most unforgiving weeks of the winter, you would find a world entirely erased of its borders. The snow does not recognize the lines drawn by emperors on heavy parchment. It does not respect the grand, aggressive ambitions of men in warm offices who speak of destiny and necessary expansion. The snow simply falls. It falls on the ruined courtyards and the shattered temples. It falls on the abandoned plows, and it falls on the cold, iron barrels of the rifles. It covers everything in a thick, heavy blanket of absolute, indifferent white. In this frozen silence, the grand geopolitical reasons for the invasion entirely lose their meaning. The empire across the sea had sent its sons into this vastness, driven by a desperate, suffocating fear of running out of resources, pushed by an ideology that demanded the subjugation of a continent. They were told they were bringing order. They were told they were invincible. But when the temperature drops so low that the moisture in your breath freezes to your collar, you do not feel invincible. You only feel impossibly small. Imagine a young soldier named Koji. He is wandering alone through a blinding, swirling curtain of snow. His unit had been moving through a narrow mountain pass when the blizzard struck, a sudden wall of white that tore the column apart and swallowed the shouts of the officers. Koji has been walking for hours. He does not know what direction he is facing. The sky and the earth have blended into a single, dizzying void. He wears a heavy wool coat, but the wind cuts right through it, finding every seam, every missing button. His hands, wrapped in damp, frozen wool, have lost all feeling. He drags his rifle by its leather strap, the weapon now nothing more than a useless, heavy anchor pulling him down into the drifts. Koji is barely 20 years old. He grew up on a gentle coastline, where the winters were mild and the ocean always smelled of salt and distant rain. He does not belong in this howling, hostile emptiness. As he forces one numb foot in front of the other, his mind begins to drift, retreating to the warm sanctuaries of his memory. He dreams of his mother's kitchen. He can almost smell the sweet, earthy aroma of roasting chestnuts on a cast-iron stove. He can almost feel the gentle, radiant heat of the family bath. The dreams are dangerous. They make him want to close his eyes and simply lie down in the soft, white drifts. The snow looks so incredibly peaceful. It looks like a bed. But then, out of the corner of his frost-caked eyes, he sees a break in the white. It is a faint, smudged silhouette against the storm. As he stumbles closer, the shape resolves into the ruins of a small, isolated farmhouse. The roof has partially collapsed, and one of the thick earthen walls has crumbled, a casualty of a battle fought months ago and already forgotten by the world. Koji pushes his way through what is left of the wooden gate. He climbs over a pile of snow-covered bricks and steps into the sheltered shell of the main room. The wind immediately loses its terrifying roar, reduced to a hollow, whistling moan through the cracks in the walls. And there, in the deepest corner of the ruined room, is a glow. It is a tiny, fragile blossom of orange light. A fire. Koji freezes. He slowly raises his heavy head. Sitting beside the small, smoking hearth is an old woman. She is wrapped in layers of ragged, mismatched clothing, a thick quilted blanket pulled up over her head like a cowl. Nestled tightly against her side, hidden within the folds of the blanket, is a small child. They are the people Koji has been told to conquer. They are the faces from the posters, the distant, abstract figures that the Empire claimed needed to be brought under the shadow of the rising sun. Koji's training screams at him. He is supposed to raise his rifle. He is supposed to shout a command. He is supposed to assert his dominance, to be the terrifying vanguard of a modern machine. He tries to lift the iron weapon. But his fingers will not close around the wood. He is simply too cold. The ideology has frozen in his veins. The old woman looks up. Her face is a map of profound, unimaginable sorrow. She has seen her world torn apart. She has heard the thunder of the airplanes and watched the horizons burn. She knows the uniform Koji wears. She knows that it is the uniform of the storm that ruined her home. For a long, agonizing moment, the space between them is stretched tight, suspended over an abyss of violence. Koji stands shivering uncontrollably in the doorway, the snow slowly melting from his shoulders and dripping onto the dirt floor. He looks at the old woman. He does not see an enemy. He sees the deeply lined face of someone's grandmother. He sees the terrified, wide eyes of the small child peering out from the blanket. And the old woman looks at Koji. She looks past the brass buttons and the heavy military pack. She sees the boy's blue, trembling lips. She sees the desperate, unfocused exhaustion in his eyes. She sees a child who is thousands of miles from his mother, standing on the very edge of freezing to death. In the grand, terrible machinery of the war, they are supposed to hate each other. They are supposed to be symbols of opposing nations, locked in a struggle for the future of the continent. But the winter does not care about the war. And in the dim, golden light of this single hearth, the labels slowly peel away, leaving only the bare, fragile truth of their shared humanity. The old woman slowly, deliberately, raises her hand. She does not point toward the door. She gestures, with a gentle, downward motion, toward the empty space on the dirt floor beside the fire. Koji lets his rifle slip from his grasp. It falls into the dust with a dull, heavy thud. He stumbles forward, his knees giving out as he reaches the edge of the hearth. He collapses onto the hard earth, holding his numb, frozen hands out toward the tiny, glowing embers. He is shaking so violently that his teeth chatter, a sharp, rhythmic clicking in the quiet room. The old woman does not speak. There is no shared language between them, no words that could possibly bridge the chasm of history that separates their lives. But empathy does not require a dictionary. She reaches out with a gnarled, unsteady hand and picks up a small, blackened iron kettle resting near the coals. She uses a cracked wooden spoon to scoop a pile of fresh, clean snow from a drift near the broken wall, dropping it into the kettle. She pushes the vessel closer to the center of the heat. They sit in absolute silence, listening to the hissing of the snow as it melts and begins to boil. The only other sound is the soft, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping child. When a thin wisp of steam begins to curl from the spout of the kettle, the old woman takes a chipped porcelain cup. It is a beautiful thing, painted with a faded blue willow pattern, miraculously unbroken amidst the ruins of her life. She pours the hot water into the cup. She holds it out to the boy in the uniform. Koji reaches for it. His hands are trembling so badly he fears he will drop it. The old woman gently guides his fingers around the warm porcelain, her rough, calloused thumb brushing lightly against his cold skin. He brings the cup to his lips. He takes a slow, careful sip. The water tastes of wood smoke and old iron, but as it travels down his throat, it feels like pure, liquid sunlight. It is the taste of survival. It is the taste of an impossible, illicit grace. As the warmth spreads through his chest, a single, heavy tear escapes Koji's eye. It traces a clean line down his dirt-stained cheek and falls into the dust. He bows his head, his shoulders shaking with a quiet, suppressed sob. He is crying for the warmth. He is crying for the home he may never see again. And he is crying because he has just realized the terrible, heartbreaking truth: the monsters he was sent to fight do not exist, and the people he is supposed to conquer are the only ones keeping him alive in the dark. The old woman watches him weep. She does not turn away. She reaches into the folds of her blanket and adjusts the sleeping child, pulling the child a little closer to the heat. This is the quiet rebellion of the human spirit. While the generals drew bold lines on maps and ordered the destruction of cities, while the politicians shouted over the radios about glory and destiny, these small, secret moments of treason were happening in the shadows. They were happening all across the frozen interior. Somewhere, on the bank of a frozen river, a sentry from the invading army and a sentry from the defending forces might spot one another through the mist. They might raise their weapons, their hearts hammering in their chests. And then, realizing they are both just exhausted men standing in the freezing mud, they might slowly lower their rifles, turn their backs, and grant each other the gift of life for one more night. Somewhere, a village doctor might leave a small bottle of medicine and a clean bandage on a rock near the edge of the forest, knowing perfectly well that the wounded boy hiding in the trees wears the uniform of the enemy. These acts of mercy did not stop the war. They did not halt the tanks or silence the artillery. The invasion was a massive, crushing tragedy that would leave scars on the earth and the soul for generations to come. But these small, illicit moments are the proof that the empire could not conquer everything. They could force men to march. They could force men to fire their weapons. But they could not entirely extinguish the quiet, enduring light of human empathy. Koji sits by the fire for hours, the hot water slowly thawing the ice in his veins. As his fingers begin to tingle with returning feeling, he reaches deep into the inner pocket of his coat. He searches through the damp lining until his fingers brush against a small, hard object wrapped in waxed paper. It is a piece of sweet plum candy. His mother had slipped it into his pocket at the train station a lifetime ago. He had saved it through the marches, through the hunger, through the terrifying battles, waiting for a moment when he truly needed to taste home. He pulls the small package out. He looks at it in the dim orange light. Then, he leans forward. He gently taps the edge of the blanket where the small child is hiding. The child peeks out, eyes wide and cautious. Koji unwraps the waxed paper, revealing the dark, ruby-red candy. He holds it out on his flat palm, offering it to the child. The child looks up at the grandmother. The old woman looks at Koji. She sees the boy's earnest, desperate need to offer something in return, to balance the scales of this incredible, silent transaction. She offers a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The child reaches out with a small, dirty hand and takes the candy. The child pops it into their mouth, and a look of profound, unexpected delight washes over their face. Koji leans back against the cold earthen wall. He closes his eyes. He is still in the middle of a terrible war. He is still thousands of miles from the world he loves. He does not know what tomorrow will bring, or if he will even survive the march back to his unit. But for tonight, in the quiet glow of this single hearth, he is not a soldier, and the woman across from him is not an enemy. They are just a grandmother, a child, and a boy, sitting together in the dark, keeping the cold away. Eventually, the long night begins to yield. The howling wind outside softens to a gentle whisper, and the thick, suffocating darkness at the cracks in the walls slowly turns to a pale, bruised gray. The storm has passed. Koji opens his eyes. The small fire has burned down to a pile of soft white ash, with only a few faint red embers remaining. The old woman is awake, sitting quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Koji knows it is time. The spell is breaking. The world will soon wake up, and they will have to put their masks back on. He slowly gathers his legs beneath him and stands up. His joints ache, and his uniform is stiff with dried mud and melted snow, but the paralyzing, deadly cold is gone from his core. He bends down and picks up his heavy iron rifle. It feels like a foreign object in his hands. He turns toward the doorway, toward the blinding white light of the new morning. But before he steps out into the snow, he turns back. He faces the old woman and the child. He stands up straight, placing his feet together. He does not offer a military salute. Instead, he bows. It is a deep, slow, and profoundly reverent bow, bending from the waist, offering the absolute maximum respect his culture possesses. The old woman watches him. She does not smile, for there is nothing to smile about. But she slowly lowers her head, returning the gesture with a quiet dignity that fills the ruined room. Koji turns and steps out into the snow. The air is crisp and biting, but the sky is beginning to clear, revealing a vast, pale blue horizon. He adjusts the strap of his rifle and begins to walk, tracing a path away from the ruined farmhouse, stepping back into the rushing, terrible current of history. He will never see the old woman again. But he will carry the warmth of that cracked porcelain cup in his hands for the rest of his life. And long after the empires have fallen, long after the borders have shifted and the guns have rusted in the earth, the memory of that illicit, glowing hearth will remain, a quiet, stubborn testament to the fact that even in the absolute deepest winter of the world, the human heart can still choose to be a place of light. Water holds no allegiances, and the earth does not keep a ledger of our sorrows. If you were to stand on the banks of a great, winding river deep in the interior, years after the first terrible storms of iron had broken across the land, you would notice a profound and startling quiet. The deafening roar of the early invasion, the frantic, terrifying energy of a world suddenly torn from its moorings, had slowly burned itself out. What remained in its place was a vast, heavy, and encompassing exhaustion. It was a weariness that had settled into the very marrow of the continent, a fatigue so deep it seemed to slow the turning of the sun. The grand, fiery speeches of the politicians in the distant capitals had long since lost their heat. The promises of a swift, glorious victory, or a sudden, miraculous rescue, had faded into the hollow, echoing reality of an endless, grinding endurance. The soldiers were tired. The villagers were tired. The sky itself seemed to sag under the weight of so many unheard prayers. But beneath this suffocating blanket of human exhaustion, a quiet, miraculous rebellion was taking place. The earth was beginning to heal. Nature, in its infinite, impartial patience, does not recognize the borders drawn by empires. It does not understand the ideologies that drive men to burn fields or shatter cities. It only understands the ancient, unbreakable covenant of the seasons. It understands that rain must fall, that roots must seek the dark, and that the spring must always follow the winter. Along the banks of the river, the deep, jagged scars of the trenches were softening. The sharp, angry edges of the dugouts, carved into the mud by terrified boys, were slowly crumbling, their rigid lines collapsing into gentle slopes. And creeping over these slopes was a soft, vibrant carpet of wild green clover and creeping morning glories. Imagine an older soldier named Ren, sitting alone by the edge of this flowing water. His uniform, once a crisp, rigid symbol of imperial might, is now faded to the color of dry dust, heavily patched and frayed at the cuffs. His boots are worn thin, carrying the heavy mud of 100 nameless roads. He sits on a smooth, gray stone, his rifle resting carelessly in the tall grass beside him, entirely forgotten. Ren is a man who has been away from home for a very long time. He can barely remember the shape of the streets in his own neighborhood. When he closes his eyes, the memory of his wife's face is blurred, like a photograph left out in the rain. He has marched across plains, he has climbed mountains, he has followed orders he did not understand, driven by a momentum he was powerless to stop. But today, sitting by the river, the momentum has completely run dry. He leans forward and dips his calloused, dirt-stained hands into the cool, rushing water. He splashes his face, washing away the dust of the long march. The water is breathtakingly clear, a ribbon of pure, liquid light reflecting the vast, open sky. As he opens his eyes, a drop of water clinging to his eyelashes, he looks down into the shallows near the bank. Resting in the soft silt, half buried by the gentle current, is an abandoned steel helmet. It has been there for a very long time. The harsh, olive paint has peeled away, replaced by a soft, blooming crust of orange rust. And darting in and out of the hollow shell, flashing like tiny slivers of silver, is a school of small, wild fish. Ren watches them. He watches how the river has taken an instrument of war and quietly, effortlessly, turned it into a sanctuary for life. A profound, heavy sorrow washes over him, but it is not a violent sorrow. It is a quiet, releasing grief. He realizes, looking at the rusted helmet, the absolute, tragic futility of everything he has been a part of. The Empire had sent millions of men across the sea to conquer a land they believed was empty, waiting to be claimed. But the land was not empty, and it could not be conquered. It could only be bruised, and even those bruises were already fading beneath the relentless, gentle march of the green vines. He reaches into the breast pocket of his faded tunic and pulls out a small, crumpled piece of paper. It is a letter from his daughter, delivered months ago. He knows the words by heart. She does not write of victory. She writes that the stone lantern in their garden has been entirely covered in a soft, bright green moss, and that she wishes he were there to see it. Ren looks at the river, listening to its soothing, ceaseless murmur. He feels the same moss growing over his own heart, softening the hard edges of his fear and his anger, returning him to the gentle, quiet man he used to be. He does not want to march anymore. He does not want to conquer. He only wants to sit by the water and let the river carry his exhaustion away, out to the vast, forgiving sea. Miles downstream, where the river bends around the foot of a towering, mist-shrouded mountain, the landscape tells the same slow, patient story. Walking along the riverbank is a woman named Akum. She is an elder of her village, a woman whose face is mapped with the deep, beautiful lines of a life spent under the open sky. She carries a woven bamboo basket balanced on her hip, and her steps are slow but incredibly steady. Years ago, when the storm of the invasion first broke over this valley, Akum and her neighbors had fled into the high caves, watching their homes burn from a terrified distance. They had lived like shadows, shivering in the dark, surviving on gathered roots and melted snow. They had watched their world end. But the world did not end. The armies moved on, chasing each other across the endless map, leaving the ruined valleys behind in the silence. And so, Akum has returned. She walks through the charred remains of her ancestral village. The wooden beams of the houses are gone, reduced to dark, crumbling charcoal scattered across the earth. The stone foundations are cracked and blackened. It is a graveyard of memories. Yet, Akam does not weep. Her tears were all spent in the dark caves years ago. Now, she is driven by a deep, instinctual need to simply continue. She stops by the stone well at the center of the ruined square. The wooden roof of the well is gone, but as she peers over the edge, she sees the dark, cool water reflecting the sky below. The earth has protected the spring. Beside the well, she notices a jagged, heavy piece of iron shrapnel, a brutal, twisted remnant of the explosions that shattered her home. It is lodged deep in the soil. But growing directly out of the center of the rusted metal, finding a tiny pocket of collected rainwater and dirt, is a single, vibrant green shoot of wild mustard. Akam kneels down in the soft earth. She reaches out with a gentle, trembling finger and touches the delicate green leaf. It is a tiny, fragile thing, completely defenseless against the harshness of the world. And yet, there it is. Pushing its way through the iron, reaching toward the sun with an absolute, undeniable stubbornness. It is the perfect, silent embodiment of her people. A soft, warm smile touches the corners of Akam's lips. She gently brushes a few stray pieces of ash away from the base of the small plant, giving it a little more room to breathe. She stands up, picks up her bamboo basket, and walks down to the edge of the river. She finds a flat, smooth stone resting in the shallows and kneels upon it. She begins to wash a few pieces of salvaged cloth, dipping them into the cool, clear water and scrubbing them against the stone. It is an ancient, rhythmic motion, a mundane chore that anchors her to the present moment. As she works, she begins to hum. It is a low, wordless melody, a soothing, repetitive sound that blends seamlessly with the rushing of the water. It is not a song of sorrow, nor a song of triumph. It is simply a song of existence. It is the sound of a woman telling the universe that she is still here, that her hands still know how to clean, and that her heart still knows how to beat. The river listens. It flows past her, carrying the dust from her clothes, carrying the ashes from the ruined village, sweeping it all away in a continuous, graceful embrace. The water does not judge the old woman washing her clothes, just as it did not judge the tired soldier resting upstream. It offers its cool, cleansing grace to them both entirely equally. It is a profound, silent witness to their shared humanity, to their shared status as tiny, fragile creatures caught in the sweeping tides of history. As the afternoon light begins to soften, turning the mist on the mountains into a glowing, golden veil, a profound sense of peace settles over the valley. The great tragedy of the invasion was born from the illusion that men could force the world into a new shape through violence and iron. It was born from a desperate, frantic belief that the future could be secured by capturing the land and breaking the will of the people upon it. But standing by the river, one can see the tragic folly of that belief. The land cannot be broken. It can only be momentarily scarred. And the will of the people is not a fragile piece of glass, it is like the water itself. It may be diverted, it may be muddied, it may be forced underground for a long, dark season. But it will always, eventually, find its way back to the surface. It will patiently, persistently carve its way through the hardest stone, smoothing the jagged edges, seeking the light. Ren watches the evening shadows stretch across the water, feeling a quiet, heavy peace settle into his tired bones. He knows his time as a soldier is ending, not through a grand surrender, but through a slow, quiet fading away of the war's terrible energy. Akam gathers her clean, wet cloth into her basket, the rhythmic sound of her humming drifting softly into the twilight. She will rebuild her home, stone by patient stone, guided by the enduring pulse of the seasons. The river flows on, cool and deep and endlessly patient. It carries the fallen leaves, it reflects the silver light of the rising moon, and it whispers a gentle, timeless lullaby to the bruised earth. It forgets the blood, it washes away the ash, and it quietly, persistently promises that after the longest, darkest nights of human folly, The morning will always return to find the green shoots pushing bravely through the ruins. When the storm finally passes, it is always the oldest hands that must gather the scattered pieces. If you were to walk into the quiet, dust-moated rooms of the elders, years after the long shadow of the 1930s had finally stretched out and faded into the evening, you would find a profound and heavy stillness. These are the people whose hair has turned the color of winter frost. They do not have the loud, certain voices of the young, who look at the past through the clean, sharp glass of history books. The elders look back through a glass that is smudged with tears, blurred by memory, and clouded by the quiet, agonizing question of how their world slipped so completely out of their hands. For them, the causes of the great tragedy are not found in the signed treaties or the borders drawn on vast, paper maps. The true causes are much smaller and infinitely more heartbreaking. They are found in the slow, invisible unspooling of the human heart. Imagine an old man named Hiroshi sitting in a small, wooden house nestled in the cedar-covered hills of his island home. Before the dark times, he was a master weaver. His hands, now spotted and trembling, once danced across a great wooden loom, throwing shuttles of silk that gleamed with the vibrant colors of the spring, deep plum, soft cherry blossom, and the brilliant, impossible blue of the summer sky. Now, the loom sits quiet in the corner of his room, catching the long, golden light of the late afternoon. Hiroshi looks at the empty wooden frame, and he remembers the exact season the colors began to fade. He remembers how the fear arrived first. It did not arrive as a sudden terror, but as a slow, creeping chill that seeped under the floorboards. It was the fear of the empty rice bowl. It was the terrifying, silent panic of fathers who looked out at a world that was closing its doors to their trade, a world that seemed vast, wealthy, and entirely indifferent to their survival. Hiroshi remembers the young men in his village, their faces gaunt with hunger, looking across the sea with desperate, starving eyes. He closes his eyes, leaning his head back against his woven chair. He realizes now, with the devastating clarity of age, that fear is a master craftsman. It takes the soft, beautiful threads of human vulnerability and spins them into something hard and unforgiving. When the men in the capital began to speak of destiny, of a glorious empire that needed to stretch its arms to survive, the frightened people listened. They listened because the speeches sounded like a warm fire in a freezing room. The fear was slowly, methodically died in the vat of national pride. And pride, Hiroshi whispers to the empty room, is the heaviest thread of all. He remembers the day the government agents came to his village, politely but firmly demanding that the looms no longer weave the bright silk. The empire needed wool. It needed heavy cotton. It needed 1,000,000 yards of dull, flat gray to clothe the boys who were being sent into the unknown. Hiroshi had sat at his loom, feeding the gray thread through the wooden teeth, hour after hour, day after day. With every pass of the shuttle, he felt the vibrant, beautiful tapestry of his culture being flattened into a single, uniform color. The pride had demanded absolute conformity. It demanded that they stop seeing themselves as a collection of gentle, individual lives, and start seeing themselves as a single, impenetrable wall of iron. But to build a wall, you must first stop looking at the faces of the people on the other side. This, Hiroshi realizes, as a single, warm tear escapes his closed eye, was the true tragedy of the invasion. It was not just a failure of politics, it was a profound, catastrophic failure of empathy. To send their sons across the sea to conquer another land, they first had to convince themselves that the people living on that land did not feel the cold, did not love their children, did not weep when their homes were broken. The empire took the great thread of fear and pride, and it wove a blindfold so thick that an entire nation forgot how to see the humanity in their neighbors. Across the dark, restless water, the sun is also sitting on a different quiet room. Here, an old woman named Sue sits by a window overlooking a rebuilt courtyard. The ancient stones of the wall bear the faint, chipped scars of the violence that swept through her youth, but a creeping vine of sweet jasmine has already grown over the deepest wounds, offering its fragrant white blossoms to the dusk. Sue holds a piece of heavy, dark blue fabric in her lap. It is an old winter coat, belonging to a husband who never returned from the long retreat. The sleeve is torn, a jagged, violent rip that she is slowly, patiently stitching back together with a silver needle. Sue has carried a heavy, burning anger for a very long time. It was an anger that kept her warm when she was hiding in the freezing mud, an anger that gave her the strength to walk 1,000 miles with nothing but the clothes on her back. She had hated the strangers who came from the sea. She had seen them as monsters, faceless demons wrapped in gray uniforms who brought nothing but fire and sorrow to her ancient, peaceful world. But anger is an exhausting companion. As the years have drifted by like fallen leaves on a slow-moving river, the fire in her chest has burned down to a quiet, glowing ember of sorrow. She pulls the silver needle through the thick wool, the soft slip of the thread breaking the silence of the room. She remembers the faces of the soldiers who marched through her village. When she was young, she only saw their rifles and their heavy boots. But now, looking back through the softening lens of time, she sees something else. She remembers a boy, a soldier no older than her own nephew, standing near the village well. He was holding his rifle, trying to look fierce and immovable, but Sue remembers how his hands were shaking. She remembers the terrified, hollow look in his eyes when the thunder of the artillery rolled in the distance. She pauses her mending, resting her hands on the heavy blue wool. She realizes that the boy was trapped in the same terrible tapestry as she was. He was just a thread, pulled violently from his own home, dyed in the gray of his empire's pride, and woven into a grand, terrifying design he did not understand. The men who designed the invasion had stolen the boy's empathy before they ever handed him a weapon. They had told him that Sue and her people were nothing but obstacles on a map, shadows standing in the way of his nation's glorious sunrise. It breaks her heart. It breaks her heart to know that the boy died in the mud of a foreign land, entirely blind to the profound, shared humanity of the people he was sent to destroy. It breaks her heart to know that if they had met in a time of peace, she might have offered him a cup of hot tea, and he might have bowed and thanked her with a gentle smile. The invasion, the elders know, was not a sudden explosion of pure evil. It was a tragedy of distance. It was the terrible, silent space that grows between people when they allow fear to dictate their vision. Hiroshi, in his island home, runs his trembling hand over the smooth, polished wood of his empty loom. He prays to the ancestors that the young generation, the children who are now playing in the sunlit streets outside his window, will never forget the danger of the gray thread. He prays they will look at the people across the sea not as rivals, not as threats, but as fellow weavers, working on the exact same, fragile tapestry of life. Sue, in her quiet courtyard, ties a final, tiny knot in the silver thread. The coat is mended. The scar remains, visible and undeniable, but the fabric holds together. She folds the heavy wool, pressing it gently with her hands. She prays that the world will remember the cost of the blindness. She prays that the long, terrible blur of her youth will serve as a permanent, heartbreaking reminder that the moment we strip a neighbor of their humanity, we have already lost our own. The twilight deepens, wrapping both the island and the continent in the same, soft blanket of the approaching night. The stars begin to emerge, small and impossibly bright, shining equally over the empty looms and the mended coats. The elders sit in the quiet, breathing in the cool evening air. They cannot undo the past. They cannot pull the gray threads back out of the fabric of history. The sorrow is woven in permanently, a dark and heavy border around the story of their lives. But as they close their tired eyes, they find a small, enduring comfort in the silence. They have survived the unraveling of the world, and they have lived long enough to see the gentle, stubborn hands of time begin to weave it back together. They carry the memories so that the children will not have to, holding the profound, heartbreaking lessons of the dark, hoping against hope that tomorrow's silk will be spun with empathy and dyed only in the warm, forgiving colors of the dawn. Even the longest, most terrible night must eventually surrender to the quiet patience of the morning sun. If you were to walk out of the cities of today, leaving behind the electric hum of the modern world, and step into an ancient forest of pine trees, you would feel a profound and immediate shift in the weight of the air. The forest is a sanctuary of deep, abiding silence. Beneath your feet, the ground is soft, carpeted by decades of fallen, golden needles. The air smells of damp earth, rich resin, and the cool, sweet breath of the mist that clings to the shadows of the valley. Trees like these do not measure time in days or years. They measure time in seasons, in the slow, imperceptible thickening of their bark, and the deep, silent reaching of their roots. They were here when the world was quiet. They stood tall when the skies filled with thunder and the horizons burned with the frantic, terrifying ambitions of men. And they are here now, standing as calm, enduring witnesses to the healing embrace of time. As we reach the end of our long journey together, we must step away from the grand, sweeping maps of empires. We must step away from the roaring engines, the endless muddy roads, and the freezing, desolate plains. The storm that swept across the continent, born of a tragic tapestry of fear, poverty, and misguided pride, has finally blown itself out. The heavy iron machinery of the invasion has long since rusted away, reclaimed by the patient vines and the soft, forgiving moss. What remains are not the grand political reasons for the war, but the quiet, lingering echoes of the human heart. Imagine a woman named Emmy. She lives in a quiet, coastal town, in a house where the sound of the ocean is a constant, soothing lullaby. It is a bright, clear morning. The sun is just beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of peach and lavender. Emmy sits on the woven tatami mat of her grandmother's old room. Surrounded by the gentle scent of dried lavender and aged cedar, she is opening a small, lacquered wooden box that has been hidden away in a closet for a lifetime. Her hands are gentle as she lifts the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded silk, is a small collection of paper. These are the letters of a boy who never came home. Emmy carefully unfolds a piece of coarse, fibrous paper. The ink is no longer the sharp, bold black of a government decree. It has softened with age, fading to a warm, melancholic brown. The handwriting is slightly hurried, the characters leaning together as if seeking warmth in the cold. She reads the words her great-uncle wrote in the freezing dark of a canvas tent, decades before she was born. He does not write about the glory of an expanding empire. He does not mention the grand, strategic necessity of securing a railway or claiming a distant field to feed a hungry nation. He writes about a stray dog he found wandering near the camp, and how he fed it a piece of his own dried fish. He writes about the frost that gathered on his blanket, looking like thousands of tiny, shattered stars. He writes, with a profound, aching simplicity, that he wishes he could hear the sound of the wind chimes hanging from the eaves of his mother's porch just one more time. As Emmy reads these words, a deep, beautiful sense of peace washes over her. The terrifying, monstrous ghost of the invading army dissolves entirely. In its place, she sees only a frightened, exhausted boy, caught in a current of history that was far too strong for him to swim against. The grand reasons for the invasion, the desperate need for resources, the blinding nationalism taught in the schoolrooms, the crushing weight of poverty that drove fathers to send their sons away, all of it melts away in the soft morning light. What remains is love. A boy's simple, enduring love for his home. Emmy holds the delicate paper against her chest, closing her eyes. She whispers a quiet thank you to the boy, honoring his memory, recognizing his humanity, and finally allowing his wandering spirit to rest in the warmth of her understanding. Across the sea, the same morning sun is rising over a vast, emerald valley. Walking slowly along a narrow dirt path between towering stalks of golden wheat is an old man. His hair is as white as the winter snow, and he walks with the aid of a smooth bamboo cane. This is WWII. When he was a very little boy, he knelt in the freezing mud with his grandfather, placing tiny seeds into a ruined, ash-covered field, hiding hope in the dark while the thunder of war echoed in the hills. Now, the earth around him is bursting with life. The scars of the artillery, the deep ruts of the refugee carts, the shattered stones of the burned villages, they have all been entirely swallowed by the boundless, forgiving generosity of the soil. The land has healed itself, just as his grandfather promised it would. Wei reaches the edge of the field, where a small, clear river winds its way through a grove of ancient bamboo. He stops by the water's edge. The river flows continuously, a liquid mirror reflecting the brightening sky. He remembers the sorrow of his youth. He remembers the cold, the hunger, and the terrifying shadows of the airplanes passing overhead. He remembers the anger he used to carry, a heavy, burning stone in his chest toward the strangers who had come from the islands, bringing such terrible devastation to his home. But as Wei looks at the water, he realizes that the stone has eroded away. Time, like the gentle, persistent current of the river, has washed the sharp edges from his grief. He remembers other things now. He remembers the old woman on the road who shared her last sweet potato. He remembers his mother weaving stories in the dark to keep him from being afraid. And, with a quiet, profound grace, he remembers looking into the eyes of a captured, wounded soldier from the invading army, seeing not a monster, but a boy who was crying for his mother in a language Wei did not understand, but a language his heart instantly recognized. Wei kneels by the edge of the river. From the deep pocket of his coat, he pulls a single stick of sandalwood incense. He lights it, shielding the small ember from the morning breeze with his withered hand. He places the incense into a small crevice in a moss-covered rock. The thin, fragrant ribbon of blue smoke rises into the clear air, twisting and dancing toward the canopy of the bamboo. Wei does not pray for vengeance. He does not dwell on the bitterness of the past. He bows his head and offers a silent prayer of profound release. He prays for the souls of his ancestors who walked the long, muddy roads of the retreat. And, in a quiet act of ultimate, everyday heroism, he prays for the boys who crossed the ocean and never returned. He forgives them. He understands that they were blinded by the gray threads of fear and pride, spun by a bureaucratic machine that had forgotten how to feel. He releases them all into the peaceful, flowing current of the river. The tragedy of the 1930s was a tragedy of lost empathy. It was a time when the world was moving too fast, when poverty and fear convinced the nation that they had to build walls of iron and take what they needed by force. It was a time when people forgot that the stranger across the water loves their children, fears the dark, and dreams of the spring exactly the same way they do. But the darkness never has the final word. If we listen closely to the quiet echoes of those years, beneath the roar of the history books, we do not hear a story of pure destruction. We hear the fragile, beautiful song of a broken arrow playing in a freezing camp. We see the shadow of a bird cast upon a cellar wall to soothe a frightened child. We feel the warmth of a shared cup of water in a ruined farmhouse. We see the tiny, stubborn seeds dropped into the scarred earth. These small, illicit moments of humanity were the true victories. They were the gentle, persistent lights that refused to be extinguished by the storm. They are the proof that even when the world is swept up in madness, the human heart's instinct is to reach out, to comfort, and to heal. Now, the sun breaks fully over the horizon. Its golden light spills through the branches of the ancient pine trees, casting long, beautiful beams across the mist. The light touches the soft green moss on the stones. It warms the damp earth. It filters through the translucent shoji doors of quiet homes, and it dances upon the surface of the slow-moving rivers. The ghosts of the past are no longer marching. The soldiers have laid down their heavy, rusted rifles. The frightened bureaucrats have closed their ledgers. The weary refugees have finally set down their heavy burdens. The long, terrifying winter is over. They are all just resting now, standing quietly in the beautiful, forgiving warmth of the morning sun. The sharp pain of history has faded into a gentle, enduring wisdom. The earth has absorbed the tears, and grown flowers in their place. You can let go of the sorrow now. The journey is complete. The heavy stories of the past have been safely told, honored, and put to rest. The sky above is vast, clear, and perfectly calm. The air is still, carrying nothing but the scent of the pines and the soft, rhythmic breathing of a world at peace. Close your eyes. Feel the gentle warmth of the light upon your face. Listen to the quiet rustle of the wind in the branches, a soft, eternal lullaby whispering that all is well. The storm has passed. The morning has arrived. And you can finally, deeply, and completely rest.